It's 13 hours Universal Time. From Washington, this is VOA News Now. Leading the news this hour, a bizarre incident in the middle of Manhattan Island as a commercial jet apparently crashes into one of the world's tallest buildings, the World Trade Center.
We'll be going to New York to bring you the latest on that. Also, more than 400 Afghan boat people turned away by the Australian military may now come back and apply for asylum.
We'll also hear how one of Taiwan's most nationalistic political parties is making overtures to the mainland.
We'll get the latest on East Timor's first-time parliamentary elections.
And hear about the latest literary controversy upsetting Muslims. I'm Russell Woodgates.
And I'm Barbara Klein. Stay with us for this hour of VOA News Now.
First, a summary of this hour's news.
I'm Pat Bodner, VOA News. A commercial plane has crashed into New York's World Trade Center. Pictures of the crash shown on cable news network show smoke coming from one of the top stories of the building. The plane is reportedly embedded in that building. An Australian federal court has ruled the government acted illegally when it turned away a boatload of more than 400 mostly Afghan asylum seekers last month. The court gave the government until Friday to comply with an order to transport the refugees back to Australia to begin processing their immigration claims. The government says it plans to appeal. The migrants remain stranded for several days on board a ship. A U.S. airman charged with raping a Japanese woman on the southern island of Okinawa has pleaded not guilty at the opening of his trial. Appearing in court in the Okinawan capital today, 24-year-old Air Force Staff Sergeant Timothy Woodland admitted to having sex with the woman, but he said it was consensual. Prosecutors allege Sergeant Woodland raped the woman in June in a parking lot outside a bar near the U.S. Kadena Air Force Base. A Chinese court has awarded $1.2 million to the family of a woman who died after contracting AIDS from a bungled hospital procedure. VOA's Jim Randall reports from Beijing.
AIDS killed Chen Su-mei after she was infected by a transfusion of tainted blood. Chinese official media report that a state-run hospital in China's Hubei province collected and provided blood without state licenses and failed to test the blood Ms. Chen needed after delivering a baby. The deadly infection was also passed to her husband and daughter, who will get court-ordered compensation in installments. The compensation award is large by Chinese standards, and hospital officials say it will seriously affect their business. Tens of thousands of people who sold blood were infected with the AIDS virus during the 1990s when blood collection agencies used unsanitary methods. A smaller number of people, like Ms. Chen, were infected when doctors used tainted blood in medical procedures. Government figures say there are 26,000 people infected with HIV in China, but officials admit the real number is more than 600,000 and growing at 30% a year. Jim Randall, VOA News, Beijing.
The fate of Afghan opposition leader Ahmed Shah Massoud remains unclear amid conflicting reports about whether he survived an assassination attempt Sunday. Media reports quote members of Afghanistan's opposition saying Commander Massoud was wounded in the attack but is alive. However, some reports quote other sources as saying he's dead. Two attackers posing as journalists exploded a bomb hidden in a video camera while interviewing Mr. Massoud. Israeli tanks have massed around the West Bank town of Jenin, and witnesses there report some shelling and gunfire. Correspondent Lori Kassman reports from Jerusalem. The Palestinians have warned that talks between Israel's foreign minister and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat will be canceled if the tanks enter the Palestinian town.
Israel has charged that Jenin is used by Islamic militants to recruit and train suicide bombers, including an Israeli Arab who detonated a bomb Sunday in the northern Israeli city of Nahariya. Witnesses in Jenin say about a dozen Israeli tanks massed around the town and started shelling a nearby refugee camp in the early morning hours. The Israeli army has not commented on the operation. At the same time, Israel also has closed several Palestinian security offices on the outskirts of Arab East Jerusalem. Israel continues to blame the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian security forces for not preventing the spread of violence. In the north of the country, 2 border policemen have been shot dead and another wounded near the West Bank village of Tulkarem. The new wave of violence has again put in doubt the Perez-Arafat talks, which were expected to take place as early as Tuesday evening. Lori Kassman, VOA News, Jerusalem.
U.S. military officials have lost contact with an unmanned reconnaissance plane over southern Iraq. Iraq says its air defense forces shot the plane down near the southern...
It's 13 hours 5 Universal Time. We interrupt our news broadcast to bring you breaking news from New York City, where a bizarre series of airplane crashes into one of the world's tallest buildings has just taken place. Within the last 30 minutes, what has been described as a Boeing 737 was seen to crash into the top floors of one of the two towers of the World Trade Center. And now, just within the last 2 minutes, live on television, another jet plane has been seen to fly into the World Trade Center.
We can tell you that it appears that the first plane remains embedded in something like the top 20 floors of the World Trade Center. This is at the tip of Manhattan Island. The tallest, of course, buildings on that island, and it appeared that another explosion, that officials were guessing that explosion was the fuselage. Now they are saying perhaps another plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We are going to go to our VOA bureau, which is right across the street from the World Trade Center. Diane Morrill is VOA's administrative assistant in the New York bureau. Diane, what can you tell us?
Well, about 35 minutes ago, I was sitting at my desk and I heard this large explosion, which I thought a truck had flipped over in the street. But as I came to the window and I looked up, I see this large gaping hole in the World Trade Center with the flames coming out. I assumed that it was an explosion, but since then we found out an airplane hit the building. And since then, another airplane has hit the second tower, and the second tower's burst into flames.
So the two towers of the World Trade Center are both on fire.
On fire. Now, and they think it's a suicide mission.
Now, it's just a few minutes after 9 o'clock in the morning. Rush hour underway. The World Trade Center, home to many corporate offices as well as broadcast facilities for local television. There could be an untold number of casualties inside the building. Are you aware of any activity down on the ground? Are people being evacuated from the building?
People are being evacuated. Everybody is starting to walk back up towards me away from the World Trade Center. They say people abandoned cars in the area when they heard the explosion because they didn't know if it was a bomb. So people have left their vehicles. The crowds are walking towards me.
Now, Diane, I assume we are seeing on television a huge amount of smoke pouring out of at least one of the towers. What can you see from your vantage point?
The first tower is on fire. There's a gaping hole where the plane entered, which is facing me with flames coming out. The side that would be facing the west side, the East River, flames are shooting out that side, all black smoke, very heavy. And where the second plane just hit, that whole side is on fire all the way around.
If our listeners anywhere tonight do have access to a television, it's a pretty safe bet that if you flip your channels, you'll probably find one satellite network at least showing you these incredible live visuals of two of the world's tallest buildings, which now resemble massive factory smokestacks. There are billows of gray-black smoke coming out of what could easily be the top 15 to 20 floors of these massive skyscrapers. And as you just reported, apparently two separate jet aircraft have been deliberately flown into the sides of these two skyscrapers. We don't know who has done it or why it's happened.
And on the line with us is Diane Morrill, VOA's administrative assistant in our New York bureau, which is about 1 kilometer away from the World Trade Centers. Diane, is it usual for planes to come over this, actually fly over Manhattan?
Oh, yes. We have a lot of small engine planes come over, but they said this plane was flying extremely low, and it made a bank at about 45 degrees, flying right into the tower. at a
see.
very high speed. They said planes don't usually fly that fast.
How about
and
commercial?
Supposed to be a single engine plane.
I see. This, this is said to be a commercial plane carrying passengers, or at least capable of carrying passengers.
Okay. Earlier, I heard it was a single engine plane that
I see.
Eyewitness had spotted, from the ground, and he noticed it was flying directly into the building at very high speed.
Clearly, there are a lot of unanswered questions. Whether it appears that a second plane, as you said, Diane, hit the second World Trade Center tower.
And I can see, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
Barbara, but looking now on television, I can see they're showing a freeze frame of a videotape of that second plane moving towards the second tower. And it's very clear from the profile of that plane that it is a large jet. It does, in fact, look like a Boeing 737, which would mean it is carrying a great deal of fuel and might also have been carrying a large number of passengers. Again, we do not know who is behind these two deliberate jet plane crashes into the World Trade Towers or why they have done it. You can imagine what kind of speculation there must be, political as well as psychological, but we don't want to make any speculation at this point. There has been no official word, as we understand it, given to any news agencies taking the blame for this. I'm sure that will be forthcoming as this story unfolds.
Indeed. Diane, we want to thank you very much for bringing us your eyewitness account, at least of what you've seen and heard there. Not far from the World Trade Centers, and we will be checking back with our New York Bureau as information comes in about these plane crashes into the two World Trade Centers in Manhattan, New York.
And again, just to recap, the World Trade Centers, 107 floors in height, a quarter mile or so into the sky. And in the past 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes or so, a jet aircraft has been seen to fly directly into the upper side of one building. And then just less than 30 minutes later, about 10 minutes ago, a second jet aircraft was seen to fly into the side of the second World Trade Tower. Now, of course, we are following this story. If there are any new developments, we will bring them to you as they happen here on VOA News Now.
In other news today, a U.S. military man charged with raping a woman on the Japanese island of Okinawa has appeared in court and pleaded not guilty. The case against Air Force Staff Sergeant Timothy Woodland opened Tuesday in the town of Naha. The 24-year-old Woodland is charged with raping the woman in June in a parking lot outside a bar near the Kadena U.S. Air Force Base. VOA Tokyo correspondent Amy Bickers tells News Now's Kent Klein that Sergeant Woodland admits having sex with the woman, but that she consented.
He said what he has previously said, which was that he did have sex with this woman, but that it was consensual, and he said that there was no violence or force used at all. He said that it was not assault.
There have been a whole series of awful incidents like this involving U.S. military personnel on Okinawa. Apparently there is a great deal of sentiment among the Japanese that they would like to see the Americans leave. What are people saying about this particular case in relation to that?
In fact, I agree with you to some extent that in general, because of this crime and a string of other crimes, some of them sex crimes, vandalism, arson, and so on, there certainly have been calls for a reduction in the number of U.S. troops, or that some of them be moved from Okinawa, where more than half of them are based, and spread somehow throughout the rest of Japan so that the burden is shared more equally. But on the other hand, many Japanese appreciate the presence of the American troops here. They think it's important. They appreciate the importance of the U.S.-Japan security alliance and of the relationship between the two countries. And in fact, surveys that have been done, even in Okinawa, show that a majority of people want the U.S. presence in the country. So certainly crimes like this do go a long way to make people sour on the U.S. presence, but in general there's still a lot of people who recognize its importance. In this particular case, one thing that was a problem was that the U.S. took several days before they handed Mr. Woodland over to Japanese authorities when he was initially accused of the crime. Now, many people were insulted by that. They took it as an offense to the Japanese legal system. A lot of local people found that just very insulting. So that, unfortunately, damaged relations to some extent. However, the U.S. did eventually turn Mr. Woodland over. They said that they had delayed doing so because they were concerned about his legal rights, but that they were subsequently able to work out an arrangement with Japanese authorities and that they were satisfied. So I think that this case will be very closely watched in Japan, particularly among the people in Okinawa.
Has there been any word on how long this trial might last?
You know, it could last a very long time. Sometimes trials in Japan actually go on for years. This trial could go on for between 5 and 7 months, or what legal sources have been saying, which is quite a long time compared to other countries, but that's how the legal system works here. Things move very slowly through the court system. Cases proceed quite slowly. So we don't think that we will have any sort of judgment or decision soon. As a matter of fact, the next trial is not until October 9th. That's nearly a month away.
That's VOA's Amy Bickers in Tokyo. If convicted on the rape on Okinawa, Sergeant Woodland faces 2 years in prison.
You're tuned to the Voice of America, coming to you from Washington. This is VOA News Now. Our top story this hour is indeed a breaking story out of New York City this morning, where there has been an outrage committed against the World Trade Center. 2 separate commercial jet aircraft have been deliberately flown into the side of the massive World Trade Towers at the foot of Manhattan Island. We do not know how or why. We do know that this comes just a few years after an unsuccessful effort to bomb the World Trade Towers by Islamic militants. But again, we have no official word that there may be any relation whatsoever to today's incidents, but we do know from what we've seen on television that there have been 2 deliberate crashes into the buildings. We don't have any reports of casualties, although they are expected to be huge, given that this is a workday in New York City. The crashes came during the early morning, about 8:30 to 9:05.
And we call them deliberate not because we have confirmation of that, but because we are seeing on television shots of actually planes hitting both towers. We have John Pittman on the line with us now from New York City. John is a former VOA staffer here, former correspondent, and we've contacted him to see what he can tell us. John?
Hi, good morning. I'm standing at 13th Street, East 13th Street and University Place, which is in Greenwich Village, looking directly south at the southern tip of Manhattan. From here I can see very clearly the 2 World Trade Centers. The westernmost tower is completely engulfed in smoke from about, I'd say the top 10th. I can't tell you exactly how many floors. The smoke is blowing eastwards, obscuring the view of the easternmost tower. From the top, it looks like it has a bit of damage about halfway down. Perhaps didn't see the accident, actually just hearing about it now from another impact or a secondary impact. You do see debris falling from the building occasionally, and again, just black, acrid smoke obscuring the top quarter of both buildings now.
John, you say you're in Greenwich Village, several blocks away from the World Trade Centers. How did you hear about this? How did you find out what was happening, or was it just obvious because these buildings are so tall?
I wouldn't have... Excuse me, there are a number of emergency vehicles traveling through this part of the city at the moment. I actually heard about it coming in on a commuter train that was pulling into Grand Central Station. Someone received a call on their cell phone, and they just exclaimed out loud for the entire train to hear, an airplane has hit the World Trade Center. If I hadn't heard that, it's obvious for everyone to see. Coming out of the subway tunnel and looking left, down, south to the tip of Manhattan, it's just a spectacle that's almost... it's just unreal.
In a city dominated by skyscrapers, the World Trade Towers do stand out. They are 107 stories tall, among the world's tallest buildings, and now they both resemble factory smokestacks as black-gray smoke continues to billow forth. We don't see any flames, however, which is somewhat surprising given that these were large commercial aircraft which both slammed into the sides of the buildings and might have been filled with very explosive jet fuel. How close to the buildings, John Pittman, are you, did you say?
So I'm a couple of miles away. 13th Street is, I'd say probably as the crow flies, I'm about 3 miles away. I can see flames flickering around the edges of the building, but most of everything is obscured by smoke. There is just sort of a necklace of fire around two corners. It looks like the northeastern corners of both buildings do show signs of flame.
So, John, you're about 5 kilometers from the trade towers. Can you see helicopters or other, planes around the towers trying to figure out what's going on? I mean, that's usually what happens, but on our television screens, we don't see anything.
I did see a helicopter pass in front of the tower just a couple of minutes ago when we began talking, but since then I haven't seen anything.
All right. Well, John Pittman, thank you very much. I'm wondering, have you talked to anyone since you've emerged from the subway? What are people on the street there saying?
I have to get back to you on that. My reporter's instinct just kicked in, and I called you immediately as soon as I saw this.
Well, we really
Perhaps we can talk later in the day.
Indeed.
Okay.
John, thank you very much. That's former VOA correspondent John Pittman talking with us from Greenwich Village, about 5 kilometers from the World Trade Center.
And just to review, if you're just tuning in to VOA News now, perhaps hoping to get a sports report, we are preempting that because of a breaking news story this morning out of New York City, where 2 jet aircraft have been flown, it appears to be deliberately. They have been steered, apparently, into the sides of the World Trade Towers at the foot of Manhattan Island. You may remember it was back in 1993 that these towers were attacked by bombers. More than 1,000 people were injured. 6 people died in that. But by the looks of it this morning, these 2 separate crashes into both of the buildings, both buildings now engulfed in smoke, could result in enormous casualties as they occurred around the 9 o'clock hour on what is always a busy business day on Manhattan Island. That's all we have to go on right now. Of course, here in Washington, the FBI is investigating. We have not received any news that there have been any formal announcements concerning the blame or the credit, if you will, for this attack. We expect that to be forthcoming, but speculation at this point would be useless.
We are going to go to Brian Jenkins, who is a terrorism consultant on the phone with us now. He is going to be giving us information now on what officials might be looking for in terms of investigating this attack and understanding exactly what's going on. Brian Jenkins joins us now from California. Mr. Jenkins, what exactly do you think officials will be looking for to determine if this was, as I'm sure many speculate, a terrorist attack?
Well, I think we should know very, very quickly. There should be information on the basis of information that would come into air traffic control about what planes were in the area, any broadcasts that may have been made from the cockpit. I mean, this is close to three major commercial airports. This is crowded airspace, and so there would be very, very quickly some information regarding the flight.
Are you aware, as a terrorist expert who we have spoken to many times here on our program, of any specific threats of this nature having been made against the U.S.?
Certainly, I haven't heard of any specific threat, but one has to keep in mind that there has been, for quite some time now, a continuing volume of threats. There are continuing alerts about the possibility of terrorist attacks directed against the United States, abroad or potentially here on American soil. So that's a continuing thing. I mean, obviously, if there were anything specific that people had, they would take steps to thwart the attack, as we have in the past when we've had information about terrorist attacks, been able to take some protective measures.
How do you expect us to receive any word from the perpetrators?
We may not receive any word. I mean, the problem that we face here is that in years past, terrorists were very quick to claim responsibility for their actions, but in more recent years, particularly in some of these more horrendous incidents, we haven't seen a claim made specifically by any group. They leave it, in a sense, to our imagination to try to figure out who is behind it. They're satisfied by carrying out the operation itself, not particularly concerned with taking credit.
Well, tell me, how would you characterize this particular attack? I mean, there have been bombs before, suicide bombings we see in other parts of the world, the Oklahoma City bombing, which many people initially thought was a terrorist attack, the bombing of the World Trade Centers themselves in 1993. But this, 2 airplanes, it appears, crashing in to these World Trade towers, this seems a huge step.
It is something that we have worried about before. It is unprecedented, but we have worried before about the possibility that hijackers might seize control of an airliner and fly it into a populated center. There have been threats in the past, not related to this particular event, but in years past, when planes were hijacked, there were threats that the hijackers might fly it in, crash it into a populated area. So the action, I mean, certainly terrorists in years ago have thought about such things, but it's clearly unprecedented, and especially in this case when there are 2 planes flying into the same set of buildings.
Yes, it seems that it for whoever is behind this, it required enormous planning and coordination to do this.
That would be a safe presumption. I mean, I think it is safe to say it's too early to speculate as to the details of who may be responsible, but I think it's safe to assume that this is a coordinated action. This is not happenstance. The 2 planes crash into the World Trade Center within minutes of one another.
Well, we could see on television one of the planes actually, the second one heading for the tower.
Yes.
Turning for it.
And now we are getting news from the Associated Press that officials at the FBI say that earlier this morning they were investigating reports of at least 1 plane hijacking. So it's possible that
As I say, we will know that very, very quickly, because planes would not be flying around in the area, particularly what appears to be, jets of, at least from what I can tell,
commercial caliber
photographs, commercial jets of this size. Those planes certainly will be identified, and we will know very, very quickly, when the plane took off and any broadcasts were made from the cockpit, or when the plane first veered off course. As I say, with something like this, I mean, you go back some years, and it certainly wasn't a terrorist event, but certainly a cause of concern was when a private general aviation small plane crashed into the White House. Whenever you have a population center, potentially major target, of course, it's going to be next to a major commercial airport. It's not something that somebody has to fly across the country and fly into a target like this. This is something that can be only, minutes away, even from any one of the runways of any one of the major airports in the area. So that's information that we'll have fairly quickly.
Well, when the FBI receives information, as they apparently have, according to AP, at least of a hijacking, what do they do with this information? I mean, they must get threats all the time, and the most serious, as I recall, the most serious terrorist threat in the United States recently. Was it not that a car was crossing over the Canadian border into the United States somewhere around the beginning of the year?
New Year's Eve.
That was at the just prior to the Millennium celebration.
Yes.
When a car crossing into the United States was driven by a person who did act suspicious, and a very alert customs official
Brian
managed to
Jenkins?
inspect the trunk and found explosives.
Excuse me, Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay.
We want to keep you on the line, but we have a little radio housekeeping to do here. We're coming up on the break in the half hour. Please stay with us.
And we also want to say that President Bush is addressing a classroom, and presumably we are going to go to the president.
Let's go live now to the President of the United States, if we can get him. He's on remote 3.
Planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
Well, we've been listening to President George. We've been listening to the President, George W. Bush, speaking at an event in Sarasota, Florida this morning, commenting on a tragedy which occurred just about 60 minutes ago in New York City, where what appeared to be a commercial Boeing 737 appeared to have been deliberately steered into the side of the World Trade Center building, followed nearly 30 minutes later by a second commercial jet aircraft, which appeared to have been deliberately steered into the second of those two buildings.
Both buildings are now there are fires, smoke, an enormous amount of smoke billowing out of both towers. There is word that, at least from one source, that the FBI received some kind of word this morning about a hijacking, but we are awaiting word, obviously, from the FBI. The statement from President Bush was very brief. I think it's fair to say that he seemed quite shaken by the news. He was addressing a classroom of children in Sarasota, Florida, when he received the news.
As far as we know, there has been no claim of credit or responsibility for these two crashes this morning, although bearing in mind that it was back in 1993 that these same buildings were bombed by agents of Osama bin Laden and were just recently convicted, in fact. That resulted in about 6 deaths and the injuries of more than 1,000 people. This morning, however, we are expecting far greater casualties. If you have access to international television, wherever you're listening to us, you will no doubt see these very sobering pictures of two of the world's tallest buildings, which appear now to be smokestacks with 10, 15, maybe half or 2 dozen or more of their top floors engulfed in flames and in smoke. So there's no telling how many people may have died or may still be trapped in those upper floors.
And for some more closer information, we're going to go now to Barbara Schatzow, who is at our New York bureau. It is again 9:30 in the morning here in Washington and in New York City. As we say, these planes crashed smack in the middle of morning rush hour at 2 huge office buildings at the tip of Manhattan. Barbara, what can you tell us? What do you know and what do you see?
Well, all I can tell you, Barbara, really is what I see, because I only know what's rumor in the street. I was on my way to work, which, of course, is downtown, only about 5 blocks from these buildings. I was coming up from the subway. People were saying, don't go up there, don't go up there. I thought someone said fight, but the word she was saying was apparently fire. I looked up. I saw what seemed to be flames coming from one side of the building, a great deal of smoke. Then, as I walked further back, I saw the other side of the building going up in flames. And what we've been watching progressively is the flames going higher and lower? In other words, more and more of the building becoming just enclosed in flames. Thousands and thousands of people running through the streets, people in tears, people crying. I had no idea what was going on. Why people, I mean, a fire is a terrible thing, but I had no idea why would people be crying. And then all of a sudden it hit me. Oh, I couldn't believe it. It's the World Trade Center. And then I started talking to people, and someone told me that he actually saw a jetliner go into one of the two towers, and that the rumor was that a bomb had exploded in the second tower. Now, of course, I'm being told that people think a plane exploded in the second tower also. All of downtown New York is being evacuated.
We can confirm that there was a second explosion in the second tower. We actually saw it on television as what appeared to be another Boeing 737 was apparently deliberately steered into the second building. Watching television, if you're able to do that where you're listening to us now, all you really see are the top floors of these two 107-story Trade Center buildings. Barbara Schatzow, there in New York at our bureau, not far from these two buildings. Can you see what's happening down on the ground?
Thousands of people are... Actually, what's happening is all the downtown buildings, and we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of people here, are being evacuated. The city... I'm actually in a federal court building, and they're evacuating that. People are lined up to get to the telephones. People before were just running through the streets. Now it's a little calmer. The federal buildings have been evacuated.
Is there much debris on the street from these crashes?
Well, I'm not close enough to see debris. What I do see is in all of this smoke that's coming out of the building, there are these little, it looks like little silver stars, like glitter, and I'm assuming that that's from what covers the material that covers the facade of the building.
Do you see any other aircraft? I'm wondering if even the U.S. Air Force, anyone is out in the skies now, either protecting the area, out to fight fire from more explosions from perhaps the fuselages of these planes that continue to be embedded in the towers?
No, I don't, but they may be on. But the smoke is so thick, Barbara, you really can't see through it. What I see and hear are hundreds of fire trucks and fire.
Yeah. It's amazing. We are given to understand that these two commercial aircraft, which are thought to have been Boeing 737s, which are pretty big, are still actually embedded inside these skyscrapers, that they didn't just hit the building and then fall to the streets, but they were either demolished by the force of the impact or just moved right through and are now perhaps responsible for the continuing thick black and gray smoke we see pouring out of both towers like smokestacks.
That, of course, gives you an idea of just how large these two towers are.
In fact, Barbara, I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a description of what it looks like from your vantage point if, you know, one has never seen buildings dominate so greatly, a skyline like this, in the midst of other tall buildings.
Well, the trade towers, one is a little bit taller than the other. It's 102 stories high. When you're looking at the buildings now, or at least let's say when I first was there, what I saw were maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 floors. And then you'd see the floor on top and the floor below. Then the floor on top of that and the floor below that. So it just progressed up. It was about 15 or 16 floors.
Mm.
Just to recap, about 60 minutes ago exactly, just 20 minutes to 9 o'clock on a busy Tuesday morning under a bright sunny sky in late summer, a Boeing 737 jet, yeah, go ahead. A jet appeared to have been a 737, crashed into the World Trade Tower there at the foot of Manhattan Island, followed 30 minutes later by a second jet aircraft, which appeared to have been deliberately steered into the side of the second building. As a result, as we speak to you now, and if you have satellite television where you're listening to us, you can probably see for yourself without too much difficulty, both of these towers appear to be functioning as massive smokestacks, as up to 24 of the 107 stories of these two massive skyscrapers are in flames and on fire.
And a rescue effort is now underway. We've been talking to Barbara Schatzow in our New York bureau and have talked to a couple of others. Actually, Barbara Schatzow was not in our bureau. She was in a federal court building nearby. The buildings in this part of New York are being evacuated. There is very little certain coming out of this. We don't know exactly what kind of planes were being flown, although there is some speculation that they are commercial jets. Initial news reports say the FBI is investigating reports that both crashes were the result of hijackings. As Russ said, the first crash happened shortly before 9 a.m. local time. The second crash occurred a few minutes later. Actually, I think it was about a half hour later. Witnesses report panic in the street. Thousands of pieces of what appeared to be office paper came drifting over the area after the second plane hit. These are huge corporate office buildings, and of course they have other businesses in them as well.
And as you might expect in a situation like this, which is many New Yorkers' worst nightmare, this has totally disrupted life down on the streets on the southern end of Manhattan. The financial district is nearby. Trading on Wall Street was suspended early this morning after the two planes crashed. Overseas markets are reacting with uncertainty. And near the area of the World Trade Centers, local buildings are being evacuated. We can only assume that the New York Port Authority, which is the municipal government agency responsible for keeping the streets and facilities open for New Yorkers, are scrambling to bring in necessary ambulances and other medical facilities. We don't know whether the elevators are even working in these buildings. It could take some time for rescue workers to reach the upper floors of the building. We know, for example, that on a normal day, it takes nearly a full minute to ride the elevator to the top of the World Trade Tower. So if there's no power this morning, it may have been difficult for rescue workers to even have reached the upper floors yet. So this is very much a story which is still in development.
Indeed, President Bush, a few minutes ago in a meeting with children in Sarasota, Florida, made a brief statement. He called these crashes an apparent terrorist attack. Here in Washington on Capitol Hill right now, Senator Edward Kennedy is, along with Laura Bush, making a statement. And now there appears to be a fire here in Washington.
This is just breaking news. We are getting live television shots now of downtown Washington with a billow of smoke in the rear, but the television screen tells us the fire is coming from the Pentagon, which is the headquarters of the U.S. military across the Potomac River in Virginia. So we now have what appear to be, within the space of 1 hour, two dramatic attacks on two of the United States' foremost symbols, one of business, the other of military. The U.S. Pentagon building may have been attacked here in Washington, and
we don't know if it's an attack. Right now it's being characterized as a fire. If it is a fire, it is huge because the amount of smoke that we can see, as Russ says, across the Potomac River into downtown Washington, over the executive office building next to the White House. There's a lot of smoke coming out.
Now, we've just received word from the Associated Press, and we heard it earlier from other news agency, that the first plane which struck the World Trade Tower building this morning, just a little more than an hour ago, on the southern tip of Manhattan, was an American Airlines jet which had been hijacked from Boston. So now we are getting news that this was indeed at least one hijacked commercial airliner. We can only speculate as to how many passengers would have been on board a commercial flight from Boston. According to what we're being told, a U.S. military person says that the plane was hijacked and it was being diverted to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York when it was apparently used for this explosion that was the first to take place at the Trade Center.
The Pentagon at this point, because of, as we say, the latest we've heard is a large fire. It is being evacuated right now, and it is also a huge building, not tall, but huge in terms of area. It's called Pentagon because it has 5 sides to it, and it occupies an enormous amount of land. It is hard to tell how large this fire is, although there is an enormous amount of smoke coming out of it, so one can only presume it's a huge fire. I was starting to say, Edward Kennedy was saying, meantime, on Capitol Hill, that any attacks, of course, at that point he was referring to the World Trade Centers. He was saying that Senator Kennedy was saying that the business of the U.S. government will not be deterred.
Well, that's brave words on a day when we're seeing 2 unprecedented attacks on a couple of big symbols in American public life. We've had 2 separate planes crash into the World Trade Towers on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, and just moments ago, we received word that there has been some kind of an explosion. We don't know what the nature of it is at the Pentagon, which is the military headquarters for the United States government just across the Potomac River. We're also told that the White House is now being evacuated, parts of it, amid what are being described as terrorist threats. So this does appear to be in some way a coordinated effort on the part of someone to attack U.S. interests right here at home, this on a day when the U.S. president is out of town. He's been in Sarasota, Florida this morning on a domestic political trip. He was on the air about 15 minutes ago saying that it did appear that the attacks on the World Trade Tower were terrorist attacks. But then within 10 minutes after he spoke, we got this explosion at the Pentagon.
And there are words of other fires as well. We have to be very careful as we report these things because there are all kinds of reporters and eyewitness accounts that can too easily get mixed up. But there's a report of fires on the Mall, down from outside VOA studios, down from the capital city. That is unconfirmed. Again, just to give you an idea of how upsetting this kind of news is, there are reports of all kinds of things going on, so we have to be very careful and wait for confirmation. We even have not yet had confirmation of the fire at the Pentagon, certainly not of any kind of fire on the Mall, although some of the networks here are reporting that.
It's 13 hours 47 Universal Time on a day which will live in infamy for the United States for the 21st century, certainly, the first part. This is the Voice of America broadcasting to you from Washington. It's VOA News Now. If you're just joining us, the news is very bad indeed for Americans today, as in New York City, just a little more than an hour ago, an attack on the World Trade Center occurred in the form of a commercial jet plane, which was deliberately flown into the side of the top stories, setting it aflame. Within 30 minutes, another plane was deliberately steered into the second World Trade Tower. As we speak at this hour in New York City, the top 24 or so stories of those 107-story buildings remain engulfed in heavy black and gray smoke. Down on the ground, thousands of people have been evacuated. Rescue workers are attempting to get to the top floors of the building and find out what the situation there is. It's expected that there will be many casualties. Meanwhile, in the last 10 minutes or so here in Washington, tragic developments have occurred here.
Indeed, word is that witnesses at the Pentagon have described an explosion going off at the Pentagon. Actually, now there's word that 2 explosions went off, and someone saw in the area a U.S. military helicopter. We don't know if that military helicopter had anything to do with these explosions. And there has been no word. We're actually just describing for you what little word is trickling out, both from New York and from Washington, coming over network television, cable news network. It is very difficult, as you might imagine, to get much information confirmed at this point. We are certain that the FBI is scrambling, as are airports, air traffic controllers, both in Washington, because, of course, there's National Airport, which is located very close to downtown Washington, as well as the Pentagon, and the New York City airports as well.
Evacuations are now underway here in the nation's capital. The U.S. Capitol building, which would certainly be a likely target for this sort of behavior, has now been under evacuation orders. The parts of the White House are under evacuation orders. We have unconfirmed reports of a fire on the National Mall, which is that long, grassy strip which extends for a couple of kilometers from the U.S. Capitol to the Washington Monument.
And the AP is now reporting that the Federal Aviation Administration has shut down all aircraft takeoffs in the United States. Air travel in the United States, as of now, has come to a halt. This presumably so that if any other attacks are planned, they will show up and air traffic controllers will be able to see them.
We're getting reports of just what might have lay behind the explosions at the Pentagon this morning. One eyewitness says he thought he saw a helicopter which may have crashed into the U.S. military headquarters. Another witness says he saw the tail of a large aircraft which might have flown into the Pentagon. Margaret Kennedy, a longtime VOA programmer here, is just come into the studio. In fact, you're just fresh out in from a drive by the Pentagon. Tell us what you saw this morning, Margaret.
Well, about 5 or 8 minutes ago, I was approaching the Pentagon from the south on the airport road because the road is very close to both the Pentagon and National Airport. And the first thing I noticed that was peculiar was there were no airplanes in the sky. The airport was shut down. And then I looked over at the Pentagon, and big black clouds of smoke began to come out of the west side. And it had just happened. The cars traveling were still going slow, and people were on their cell phones frantically talking to everybody else.
Could you identify anything on the side of the building that looked like parts of an aircraft?
No, I was on the side opposite from where the plane had apparently hit. People were talking...
If in fact it was a plane.
Well, people were talking, hooked onto local radio stations, saying that they actually saw the fuselage.
This is at the Pentagon. They saw a fuselage. We did have word of an eyewitness account, I should mention, of a helicopter, a U.S. military helicopter, hovering over the Pentagon right before this explosion. This is unconfirmed, but it is a witness account.
I hadn't heard that one. Mm-hmm. I had heard this supposed eyewitness in an apartment building on a residential area that was on the side where the smoke was coming out of.
Margaret, since you've just come into the building, I'm wondering, there's also word that right outside the VOA studios, which is the Washington Mall between the Washington Monument and the U.S. Capitol, that there were fires or a fire on the mall. Did you see anything?
No, I didn't see that side of the building at all. Actually, the city streets are oddly very quiet.
Okay.
Well, we are receiving reports that most major U.S. government facilities are being evacuated this morning. The U.S. Capitol building, the White House, the U.S. State Department are all being evacuated. Employees are being told to get home in as orderly and safe a way as possible. A Secret Service agent says that a credible threat was made against the White House this morning and against the presidential mansion itself. So that has precipitated the evacuation there, as well as the events of this morning in New York City, and now here in the nation's capital as well. Now, if you're listening to us tonight or elsewhere in the world, the main impact this could have for you is that if you or someone you know is planning to travel to the United States by air, they will have their plans disrupted, as the U.S. government has now ordered that all airports coast to coast be shut down for the time being. There are no planes entering or leaving U.S. airspace, and there are no planes flying within U.S. airspace.
And that is because planes are directly involved in the crashes, explosions, and so forth that we are reporting about this morning. 2 planes hitting both of the World Trade Centers, or Center Towers, the tip of Manhattan in New York City. Now there is word that the fire, the explosion at the Pentagon, was caused indeed by a plane. We do not have confirmation of that, but all the major broadcast networks are reporting that a plane hit the Pentagon. Of course, when we get confirmation of that, we will bring it directly to you. It is very difficult, of course, to report on outbreaks such as this. Several major centers of activity, the business center of New York City, the governmental center here in Washington, and of course the Pentagon being a major symbol of that as the home of the U.S. Defense Department. The sites of explosions, fires, and apparent attacks by planes actually hitting them. This appears to be a coordinated effort. Our terrorism consultant, Brian Jenkins, who we spoke with earlier, appeared to agree that this seems to be a deliberate and coordinated attack.
We have to say, however, that we have not received any official word on that, and there are no reports that the government has either. However, it may be remembered that back in February of 1993, the two World Trade Towers were attacked by agents of the Islamic militant Osama bin Laden. They were recently convicted in New York City federal court, and it has been widely reported that Osama bin Laden has pledged to avenge their convictions, which now might appear to have been accomplished. But again, we have no confirmation of that whatsoever. And for now, at least, people are being preoccupied with the logistics of trying to move in and rescue those who are being affected by these massive explosions, one here in Washington at the Pentagon, two in New York City in the two twin towers of the 107-story World Trade Center. All three attacks occurred by aircraft being deliberately steered into them. And so now the U.S. government has ordered a complete national ground stop, which means there is no aircraft permitted to fly anywhere in the United States or from the United States or to the United States.
And not only is aircraft being halted, federal agencies here in Washington are being evacuated. Precautions are being made. So not only are there rescue attempts, there are all kinds of attempts to get people out of harm's way, potentially in case any other attacks are planned. Remember, this is rush hour on a Tuesday morning, late summer. Kids are just back in school, so the summer season is over. People are, for the most part, back from vacations. The World Trade Center offices are were likely to be full this morning, packed with people sort of getting ready to start the week and start back from vacation.
In fact, we have no word on casualties from either the World Trade Center buildings or from the Pentagon, but we can expect they will be significant. We are also given to understand that one of the two jets which were deliberately crashed into the World Trade Tower may have been a commercial American Airlines jet, which had been hijacked this morning from Boston, Massachusetts, likely to have been carrying numerous paying passengers. Their fate, of course, would have been decided at the point of impact.
President Bush, a short time ago, made a brief statement. He was in Sarasota, Florida, away from Washington. Our White House correspondent, Paula Wolfson, though, is at the White House and joins us on the line now. Paula, what can you tell us?
Barbara, actually right now, I, along with the rest of the press corps and everybody else who works at the White House, is about 2 blocks away on H Street, 2 blocks from the White House, across the park. The White House was evacuated abruptly about 40 minutes after the two twin trade center towers in New York were hit by those planes. There are fire trucks surrounding the White House, although no sign of an incident on the White House grounds, but it has been evacuated. The president, we understand, is en route back from Florida, back to the White House to monitor the situation.
Paula, why, this may seem a silly question, but exactly why was the White House evacuated upon word of the explosions in New York?
Well, I think it was heightened security. I think as soon as that happened, it was considered an attack on American soil, and then they figured they might attack spots in Washington as well. They may have had some indications. You know, it's hard to figure out exactly what the Secret Service, which protects the White House, is doing sometimes because they do work in secret. But apparently they had good enough reason. They came through the building. They said to everyone, get out now.
Paula, there are unconfirmed reports. Actually, Paula, hold on just a minute because there are more developments in New York City.
Those are developments which are breaking now as we see that another massive explosion is taking place at the foot of the World Trade Center buildings.
We will have
It's 14 hours Universal Time. From Washington, this is VOA News Now. If you're just joining us, we are bringing you special coverage of breaking news this morning. As in New York City at the World Trade Towers, there have been massive explosions causing widespread loss of life and fire involving from a plane which has been deliberately flown into the headquarters of the U.S. military. This all appears to be a coordinated attack. The U.S. president says it appears to be terrorist activity. All air activity in the United States has been ordered stopped. And at this hour, we don't quite know what may happen next. But looking at live television, Barbara, you can see there's been another massive explosion in New York.
Well, it looks as if the South Tower of the World Trade Center has, at least in part, collapsed. They don't know if it's another explosion or just under the, actually a result of the plane crashing into it, subsequent fires, that the South Tower has, for the most part, seemingly collapsed. This at the tip of Manhattan. These are huge buildings, the largest buildings in the world. Just to give you some comparison, in Malaysia, the Petronas Towers are 452 meters.
Yes, we're now seeing a videotape of what just happened moments ago at the World Trade Center. One of the two towers, which has been on fire for the past 75 minutes or so, has literally crumbled almost a quarter mile down onto the streets of New York City. This is a major catastrophe. If you have access to satellite television, wherever you're listening to us, you will no doubt be able to see it as we are. This is a major catastrophic event in New York City at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning.
Precautions are being taken in New York City. I'm certain in the area of the World Trade Center, certainly here in Washington, D.C., where there's been an explosion and apparently a helicopter has been involved at the Pentagon, the U.S. Capitol, the State Department, and the White House, as well as other federal agency buildings, all evacuated. Paula Wolfson, our White House correspondent, is on the line with us. Paula, we were talking to you a few minutes ago about the White House evacuation, taking precautions, the Secret Service doing most of their work in secret. But there was word earlier that there was some kind of threat made against the White House, received by officials. Do you know anything about that?
Not at the moment. Again, they're holding this very close to the vest. They're trying not, as best they can in a situation as terrible as this, trying not to create a sense of absolute panic. They're trying to keep everybody as calm as they can. And certainly that's what the president was doing when he went on national television, when he said, we will get to the bottom of this. Terrorism will not stand in the United States. And it was perhaps an attempt just to calm the public as much as possible in these difficult times.
Can you describe what the scene is, where you are, and exactly where you are?
I am about, 2 blocks from the White House right now on a fairly busy street corner. There's a park, Lafayette Square, near the White House. I'm at the far end of the park. It's as close as they will let us come to the building. And actually, right now, they're moving us back, I believe, a little bit farther, down another block or so, as a precaution. We don't know what is going on in the White House grounds. All the reporters, all the camera crews were told to leave. At first, we were told we could stay at our own risk, and then they came through and said, everybody get out.
Well, Paula Wolfson, you're at the White House there, where things are relatively calm. Sadly, in New York City this morning, in just the past few minutes, we've had major devastation resulting from the crash about 90 minutes ago of a commercial jet into one of the 2 twin towers of the World Trade Center. One occurred 30 minutes after the other, resulting in both towers being engulfed in flame and smoke on the top floors, the top 24 or so floors. Within the last 5 minutes, live on television, people have witnessed the collapse of one of those two towers onto the streets below. We have no idea how many hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties may have resulted. And of course, the second tower, which is right next to it, which remains in flame,
with an airplane embedded in it,
may be the next to go. Now, the U.S. government has ordered all aircraft grounded coast to coast, which means we are not able to see a very high-level photograph or video of what the scene looks like within the larger context of Manhattan Island. But pictures which we're receiving from nearby skyscrapers suggest that this is truly a devastating building collapse at the foot of Manhattan Island, which is going to result in very long-term destruction.
Remember, these buildings are about 107 stories, anywhere between 415. One is 415 meters tall, the other 417 meters tall. So you can imagine what that must be like to see it collapse. John Pittman has been talking with us from New York, but apparently we have lost that connection for now.
If you're just joining us for our regular 14-hour 6 edition of VOA News Now, we are bringing you special coverage of a truly devastating series of events which have occurred within the past 90 minutes here in the United States. About 90 minutes ago in New York City, just before 9 o'clock on a busy Tuesday morning, a Boeing 737 passengers jet was apparently deliberately steered into the side of the World Trade Center, one of the two twin towers among the world's tallest buildings. Within 30 minutes, another jet was seen to be deliberately steered into the side of that building. Now, just about 30 minutes ago, we received reports of an explosion at the U.S. Pentagon, the military headquarters of the U.S. government here in Washington. Many government buildings are being evacuated, and there is, needless to say, widespread fear and concern, not only about the casualties involved, but what may happen next.
In addition to confusion and fear, there is an enormous amount of speculation, so why don't we review what is in fact known and confirmed. Apparently, coordinated terrorist attacks striking the World Trade Center buildings and the Pentagon in Washington. Just moments ago, one of the 110-story World Trade Center towers collapsed. President Bush, speaking about 45 minutes ago, is not in Washington. He is on his way back to Washington. Earlier, he called the crashes in New York an apparent terrorist attack. He has ordered a full-scale investigation to, in his words, hunt down those who committed the attack. Witnesses say an aircraft plowed into a helicopter landing pad near the Pentagon about an hour after the New York City crashes. That building, the Pentagon, is on fire. One witness told the Associated Press it looked like a huge orange fireball. There are no reports of injuries there, at least not yet. Another fire was reported on the mall in Washington, not far from the White House. Most U.S. government buildings in Washington have been evacuated, including the State Department and the U.S. Capitol, and aviation authorities have grounded all airplane takeoffs in the United States.
As you might expect, we're trying to get through to people in New York City who can give us an eyewitness account of what's been happening there in the past few minutes. But given the apparent devastation caused by the collapse moments ago of one of the two twin towers of the U.S. Trade Center, telephone communications are being made very difficult, so we are unable to reach some of our eyewitnesses in New York City. It was just 10 minutes ago that the 107-story World Trade Tower collapsed onto the streets of southern Manhattan. There is another tower, also 107 stories tall, next to it, which remains engulfed in smoke and flame and may also soon crumble onto the streets below. There is no knowing at this point just how much carnage will result. There were certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of office workers in both buildings, to say nothing of the many hundreds and thousands of those on the streets below. They all had been only evacuated within the past hour, so it's a safe bet that there are going to be numerous casualties.
And it's a safe bet that much of the speculation of these apparent attacks is centered around, or at least is being characterized as terrorist attacks. And Russ, when you think back on some of the more recent attacks, there was the USS Cole, the battleship being that was attacked near Yemen, near a port in Yemen. Then before that, there were the U.S. Embassy bombings in Africa.
And it was back in 1993 that the World Trade Towers themselves were bombed. 6 people died in that incident. More than 1,000 were wounded, however. 6 Islamic militants were just recently convicted in that bombing. They have been sentenced to life imprisonment. That attack in 1993 was meant to force the U.S. to curb its support for Israel and to stay out of the Middle East. Those Islamic militants were all tied to Osama bin Laden, who is thought to have been the mastermind of that. We have no word of any credible claims of responsibility for today's attacks by any Islamic militants, although reaction among some Islamic militants has been positive. The Agence France-Presse reports that in Lebanon, many Palestinian refugees celebrated when they heard of the attacks in New York and Washington. But that is not to suggest that there is any connection between these terrorist attacks and either Osama bin Laden or any other militants.
Absolutely. These do seem coordinated, but there obviously is since there's no information on who's behind them, we can't know that for sure. We do know that VOA's Jim Stevenson is standing outside the White House here in Washington, the White House having been evacuated along with other agencies. Jim, what exactly is the scene there outside the White House?
Well, apparently we've lost connection with him, too. Telephone communication is being disrupted along with much else this morning here in the United States, at least along the East Coast. As you can imagine, literally millions of people are placing telephone calls to New York City and Washington, many more trying to place telephone calls out of New York City. This is major devastation. If you've just joined us, we have a truly cataclysmic disaster on the southern tip of Manhattan Island this morning following attacks within the past 90 minutes by commercial jet aircraft which were deliberately steered into the side of 2 of the world's tallest buildings, the World Trade Towers at the foot of Manhattan Island. They've been engulfed in flames in the past 90 minutes. One of them, just about 12 minutes ago, collapsed into the streets of New York. And as more and more people wake up across America this morning, turn on their televisions, hear the news, find out what's happening, they're all trying to pick up telephones and call loved ones living on the East Coast to find out what's happening. That's making it very difficult for us to do the same.
But we do have some quotes from witnesses this morning in New York City. Sean Murtagh, a CNN vice president, was nearby. He describes, and I'm quoting here, the plane was coming in low. It looked like it hit at a slight angle. That, of course, he's talking about the plane attacks, the plane crashes into the World Trade Centers in New York City.
One of those planes had been thought to be a Boeing 737. If we can, for the record at least, now set it straight, we're told it was a 767, a slightly larger jet.
Indeed.
And we have reports that American Airlines Flight 11 out of Boston, Massachusetts this morning had been hijacked and was being diverted to John F. Kennedy International Airport just outside New York City. And investigators, again, this is all preliminary, believe it may have been that commercial American Airlines jet which was hijacked and then flown into the side of the World Trade Center. Another jet, within 30 minutes, was seen to do the same thing. And then about 20 minutes ago or so, 30 minutes ago, some kind of aircraft, some say a helicopter, others say a jet, was flown into the Pentagon building here in Washington, the headquarters of the U.S. military. That building is now on fire, although it's not a skyscraper. It's only about 6 stories tall and has not sustained anything like the damage we're seeing in New York City.
Now, in terms of the kind of terrorism the United States has seen, we have seen nothing to this extent, if indeed this does turn out to be the result of a terrorist attack. Just to put this in some kind of context for you, the number of global terrorist attacks increased in the year 2000 to 423 attacks. That's a rise of 8% over 1999, according to an annual terrorism report by the State Department. The report attributed the increase in large part to conflicts in Colombia. There, of course, has been no mention of Colombia this morning in surrounding the incidents in New York and Washington. But in Colombia, 2 rebel groups had staged repeated attacks on multinational oil pipelines.
Just to review, if you're just tuning in here, it's 14 hours 16 Universal Time. This is the Voice of America, broadcasting from Washington with VOA News Now, in a national capital which, for all intents and purposes, has been shut down. The White House, the State Department, the U.S. Capitol, many federal office buildings, all evacuated, employees being sent home in an orderly and safe a manner as possible following disastrous attacks, not only here in Washington but also in New York City this morning, apparent terrorist attacks on the World Trade Tower buildings in New York and here in Washington on the U.S. Pentagon building just across the Potomac River. And amid what we're told have been credible terrorist threats against the White House. President Bush was caught unawares this morning in Florida on a domestic political trip. He is said to be on his way back to Washington, but you can only imagine what the security headaches must be surrounding bringing him back into the skies on a day when we have seen airborne attacks against U.S. targets.
And of course, now just to repeat, all U.S. air traffic, aside from that carrying the president, has been ground down to a halt. Security precaution taken nationwide so that certainly any possible attacks can be tracked and that control towers can have regained some control after what apparently were hijacks of American Airlines planes in Boston. One plane, I should say, in Boston, although we do know that 2 separate planes, one each striking each of the World Trade Center towers.
Just 18 minutes ago, one of the 2 twin towers of the World Trade Center collapsed. It was 18 minutes which separated the bombings of those 2 buildings. Cameras are now fixed on the 107-story second building, where it is now feared a similar collapse may occur, wreaking destruction and devastation again now on the foot of Manhattan Island. There is serious concern now by the New York City authorities that the second trade tower building is about to come down, as it's been now 18 minutes, which is the same time which elapsed between the attacks on the 2 buildings.
We are joined now by Tony Cordesman, who is a senior fellow of strategic assessment. He joins us on the line now with expertise in Middle East and South Asian security issues. Mr. Cordesman, with all presumably just this side of panic breaking out in New York City and certainly at the Pentagon, what kind of precautions and procedures can officials take at this point to both rescue those in harm's way immediately and to prevent any further attacks?
Well, first, let's be very careful. There's no sign of panic anywhere. The Pentagon is being quietly evacuated. In the case of the World Trade Center, it's important to note that this is a contingency which has been studied since the 1970s. It is a horrible reality now, but New York's emergency response team is not unprepared for this. Obviously, there is no way that anyone can immediately deal with the crisis created by the collapse of one tower of the World Trade Center and possibly a second, but emergency response planning, medical help, all of these measures are almost certainly being implemented, and they are going to be implemented on the basis of contingency plans, which are not going to have to be improvised as if no one had ever dealt with this before.
What kind of plans, what's involved in these contingency plans? I mean, on the television screens, we don't see helicopters, we don't see, at least from the air, efforts to put out the fires. So what kind of contingencies are
the
involved?
Basic fact is you're dealing with buildings on the edge of collapse. Putting out the fires isn't going to do anything. At the heights involved, you simply cannot use firefighting techniques. Nothing a helicopter did at this point would matter unless it could evacuate people which had moved to the top of the building, and certainly helicopters will be surveilling that. The emergency responders face the fact that one tower has collapsed, another may collapse at any moment. Throwing in emergency response teams into a building where the people are trying to evacuate may simply be killed along with the response team is not something that's going to help. What you have to do is be ready on the periphery, provide as many ambulances as possible, prepare the hospitals, clear the routes for evacuation and emergency movement where people can be taken out of these buildings. All of this is not going to produce the kind of life-saving measures that would be possible when you weren't dealing with such a catastrophic attack. But it is the kind of measure which is as effective as measures can be under these conditions.
Well, Tony Cordesman, you're a man who has spent his career examining contingencies, military as well as civil, involving terrorism and regular military activities. Are we likely to see any... Is there a plan, given this development, to shut down some of the heretofore routine aspects of American commerce, transportation, communication?
The problem that you face here is we're a free and open society. We can be attacked at virtually any point. Our information systems, our infrastructure, our financial systems, physical plants, symbols of our nation like the Constitution, key centers of government. There are literally tens of thousands of points of vulnerability. Now, we have been working for something like the last 10 years to try to improve homeland defense capability. A lot of that effort has been, up till now, focused more on issues of bureaucratic control, research, slow improvements in response and defense, simply because no one anticipated that there were terrorist groups capable of this level of sophistication and coordination. It's quite obvious that one of the immediate steps that's going to have to be taken is to completely reorganize that homeland defense effort and give it a new priority.
Put in perspective for us, you mentioned this level of sophistication and coordination. What is the amount of sophistication that was needed to carry off this kind of apparent attack?
The immediate sophistication is that it's really unlikely that the pilots were hijacked into flying their aircraft into buildings. This is not something where someone points a gun to your head and says, commit suicide or I'll kill you. You had to be able to take over 3 aircraft. You had to do so with a knowledge of the flight patterns. You had to be able to coordinate 2 attacks in New York, a 3rd attack against the Pentagon, know the air control routes well enough to provide some kind of cover. Now, that alone is an extraordinarily sophisticated attack, particularly because most terrorist movements tend to talk, they tend to leak information. They're often far more political and verbal than active. This is, at a minimum, a very sophisticated multiple attack by what has to be a relatively large group with extraordinary organization and discipline.
Indeed, we're now receiving reports that according to senior law enforcement officials outside the State Department a few minutes ago, a car bomb exploded. So now we have 3 aircraft attacks. We have reports of a car bomb explosion. Who knows what could happen next?
Well, the real problem here is that we have never identified the kernel of an organization with this level of sophistication. People have examined the Iraqi capabilities for many years. They have never seemed to be directed toward this level of operation, and certainly not had the capability in the United States. We have seen Iranian extremists support or talk about such groups, but not organized to act. Bin Laden's movement was seen as an important umbrella group, but not one with the capability to, up till now, pull together all of the elements for this kind of attack, even though it is the only group which has talked about this kind of attack and near war against the United States.
Now, no national emergency has been called at this point, but I'm wondering, there is something called DEFCON, standing for Defense Condition. What constitutes a national emergency and a DEFCON?
There are two completely different things. The president would declare a national emergency when the state and local responders could not take the lead in the operations necessary for response. That's different from providing the governor, the mayor of New York, people in Washington with every possible federal assistance to go on and support the movements and activities they're already taking. To do that, we would have to have a clear indication that there was first a reason, a federal action that had to be taken, and second, it could not be done or taken under the leadership of the mayors and governors. Now, DEFCON is a completely different situation. Whenever the United States is under attack, we raise the level of readiness. With this come all kinds of force protection measures. We bring people back into military headquarters. We seal off military bases.
This is all over the world.
This is all over the world. Now, obviously, in a case like this, we have to anticipate that there may be follow-on or supporting attacks outside the United States. It seems extraordinarily doubtful that this could be done by some militia or U.S. domestic terrorist group. That is a theoretical possibility, but we are now looking either for a terrorist group overseas that we have never identified in the past, or a level of sophistication within groups that we do know, and there are really 2 that have tried this level of attack in the past, the Red Brigades in Japan, which frankly seem to have very little operational capability like this today, and some group, not perhaps led by bin Laden, but affiliated with him.
The vice chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Richard Myers, has said that there were reports of another hijacked plane heading from New York to Washington. That was shortly before the Pentagon explosion, therefore possibly making a link between the explosion at the Pentagon and a flight that was coordinated with the 2 planes that struck the World Trade Center towers. If you are just joining us, we are reporting on several catastrophic attacks and events in the United States in 2 major centers, our business center in New York City, the 2 World Trade Center towers, among the tallest buildings in the world, were attacked by 2 separate airplanes, a plane each, flying directly into the towers. For a time, both planes were embedded in the towers. One tower has since collapsed.
And now, Barbara, we're watching on live television as, sadly, as expected, the 2nd World Trade Tower has now collapsed under its own weight, crashing to the streets of southern Manhattan next to the debris left by its twin just 30 minutes ago. So two of the world's tallest buildings in the space of less than 2 hours have been attacked, burned, and now completely destroyed at the foot of Manhattan Island. There is no telling how much human life has been lost as a result of this, or what indeed may happen next. Tony Cordesman, we want to thank you for joining us. We have to do a little radio housekeeping here as we're coming up on a half-hour break. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
It's 14 hours 30 Universal Time. From Washington, this is VOA News Now, bringing you special coverage on our affiliate stations and the International Music Mix Network as well of a truly tragic, devastating, catastrophic series of events which in effect defy explanation. Here in the United States this morning, within the past 2 hours, major attacks on the World Trade Tower centers on the foot of Manhattan, which have now been utterly destroyed. I'll repeat that. They have been utterly destroyed by commercial airplane attacks earlier this morning, which were made against them. And then here in Washington, in the nation's capital, an aerial attack on the headquarters of the U.S. military, the Pentagon, as well.
There is word that all of the planes involved, certainly at least 2 of them, were hijacked. Some of the reports say they were hijacked from the northeastern city of Boston, Massachusetts.
Now, we have not received any word of responsibility for these atrocities, although there is widespread speculation that there may be an association with Islamic terrorist Osama bin Laden. The only reason for that is because it was in 1993 that the World Trade Center was attacked by his agents. In fact, they were just recently convicted and sent to life imprisonment by federal court in New York City.
And our security expert, Tony Cordesman, told us a few minutes ago that attacks of this level of sophistication and coordination were not anticipated, that the United States intelligence community, at least as far as he knows, does not have has not identified the core of a terrorist group capable of carrying out attacks such as these.
Now, the big story this morning is coming out of New York City, where, as I just told you, we have utter devastation at the foot of Manhattan Island. As you can imagine, at 10:30 in the morning, it's still early morning across much of the rest of the United States. Millions of Americans are waking up, hearing this news, and they are reaching for their telephones, hoping to call friends and loved ones in New York City. That has made it virtually impossible for us here in Washington to reach contacts there as well. However, we have been able to get through on the telephone to someone closer to home, Jim Stevenson, VOA reporter, who is here in Washington outside the White House. Jim, tell us what the scene is there.
Well, thank you very much. As you mentioned, phone service is very disruptive at the moment. I have a mobile cellular telephone that has been unresponsive, as most people on the street are trying to call their loved ones and cannot get through. Fortunately, I am calling on a payphone inside a small restaurant just a block away from the White House. Right now, security around the White House, as you may imagine, is extraordinary. Police, emergency vehicles, and Secret Service are in the streets right now, cordoning off a huge area around the White House. Looks to be about 3 or 4 blocks in radius at the moment. That may very well expand as we speak. The folks who are working down here in the immediate area at the various federal agencies are making their way home. All of the offices in this area have been closed as a precautionary measure and also to assist in any emergency efforts that may be needed. It is an orderly exit from the city. There is no panicking in the street. People are walking at a moderate pace to bus lines. They were trying to take subway lines out. The subway has just been closed probably about 15 minutes ago. They shut down the red line of the Washington subway, which runs fairly close under the ground to the White House. And, of course, that is a primary concern for law enforcement and Secret Service. But at this moment, the White House is fine. It is very well protected. The house itself having some of the most elaborate protective devices of any building in the world.
Jim,
and there are also planes flying overhead right now. We can see fighter jets circling downtown Washington, presumably protecting from any further airstrike in this area.
An unprecedented spectacle. We received earlier word that a car bomb had exploded near the U.S. State Department. Have all the streets around the White House been cleared by tow trucks?
There are still vehicles parked on the street. Immediately adjacent to the old executive office building, which is just off to the side of the White House, I did not see any vehicles parked there. I presume that was the first area that they cleared off. From my vantage point, there are still vehicles on the side of the road here, but traffic is moving at a slow crawl, but it is moving. Most of these streets, by the way, do have parking restrictions on them in the early morning hours to assist with the crush of commuters coming through. So in terms of parked vehicles around here, there really are very few.
Well, it's not just parking restrictions. We want to inform our listeners as well that if you have any travel plans that are designed to bring you to or from the United States today, you can forget about them. The United States government has ordered what it calls a national ground stop. There is no air traffic, commercial air traffic that is, permitted coming into or leaving the United States. There is no air traffic permitted within the United States.
And this, of course, because of the two planes that struck the World Trade Center towers on the tip of Manhattan around 9 o'clock this morning, local time. Sylvia Sansoni of Forbes magazine actually watched as one of those towers collapsed about an hour?
35 minutes ago.
About 35 minutes.
Yes.
And the other one
Sylvia.
just collapsed about 5 minutes ago.
So where exactly are you, Ms. Sansoni?
Well, the office is located on 5th Avenue and 12th Street. So from 5th Avenue, you have a very clear view of the two towers. At least you used to have a clear view of the two towers. And the avenue is completely empty, and there are hardly any cars. And there are crowds gathered in the street, and they were virtually hypnotized looking at this tower as it came down. And then there was a huge cloud of smoke. And when the smoke cleared, the tower had disintegrated. It looked like, and of course that created a lot of panic and. People are crying and hugging. And,
These are huge towers, Ms. Sansoni. As you watched it come down, how long did it take? Is it even
It probably
real?
took about 3 to 4 seconds, and it seemed to collapse vertically, so that it almost looks as if it were designed to fall very, very tidily. I don't know what the damage in the surrounding area would have been. But
Now, what is your location?
that was my vantage point from 12th Street and 5th Avenue.
12th and
so
5th
in the
Avenue, not that far away. We have no aerial photography, of course, because, as I just reported, there is no commercial air traffic permitted this morning. But I think perhaps from Staten Island or some vantage point far off, the video of the collapse of the second building has resulted in dust and smoke, which, for lack of a better term, looked like a volcanic eruption engulfing the entire southern part of Manhattan Island. Has that spread north? How much of Manhattan is under dust?
Not that much. It's a very clear day. It's quite a breezy day, and the winds are sort of blowing away the smoke, so the sky is still crisp blue. And it almost feels like nothing ever happened now that the two towers are gone. I mean, there's still a lot of dust and smoke and what have you, so that's localized where the two towers were, but the rest of the sky is clear. And it's sort of an eerie feeling.
Well, I'm wondering more about your feelings now. Here in Washington, as you may have heard, many of the buildings are being evacuated because of the explosion at the Pentagon. Do you have every intention of staying at your office? Are people around you going home? What's the feeling?
The buildings here at Forbes magazine has not been evacuated, although most people are out in the streets. And a lot of people who commute to work are sort of trapped in the city. It's hard to get out now for obvious reasons, so people are making sleeping arrangements. And it's nobody really knows what to do. I don't think we're going to get a lot of work done.
We're told that Wall Street has suspended trading for the entire day and perhaps beyond as well.
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, they're right in the heart of it. So I'm not exactly sure where the area is being cordoned off, but I live downtown, fairly near the towers, and that area is still accessible to pedestrians. No cars are being allowed into the area.
Have you been able to tune into local radio? What measures are being taken for local citizenry? Are they being directed to churches or to local meeting places to sort of sit this out?
At the moment, I have not gotten any news of sort of local emergency measures. I think they're just, as far as I can see, fire trucks and ambulances are rushing to the scene. But I think the immediate concern is to deal with the injured and ordinary day-to-day civilians who look like they're going about their business as they always do.
All right. Well, Sylvia Sansoni, thank you very much for taking time out to talk with us and share your perspective of what's happening in New York. Now we are going to turn to Michael Scharf, who joins us on the line. He was with the Council for Counterterrorism at the State Department, worked on the investigation into the Lockerbie bombing in Scotland, you may recall, where a huge jetliner exploded, killing everyone on board on the ground in Lockerbie, Scotland, not only those on board, but people who were in the town. Michael Scharf, tell us, we were told earlier today that by Tony Cordesman, a national security expert, that attacks of this level of sophistication and coordination were really not anticipated. In your view, what were attacks of this level of sophistication predictable? Michael Scharf, are you with us?
Well, as we've been reporting, this is a unprecedented telephone communications day, as literally millions of Americans across the country are trying to reach loved ones in New York City, as well as here in Washington. All U.S. commercial air traffic has been halted. You can imagine the effect that is having on commerce and on communications here in the United States. So we're having difficulty as well getting through to people.
But we do have people here in Washington who've come to work here at the VOA studios, have passed by the Pentagon, which, as we reported, we should bring you up to date, which suffered a huge explosion about an hour and 15 minutes ago. There is word that a plane was involved in that. Our own Neil Curry and Paul Popowitz are in the studio now, both of whom have seen, at least passed by. Paul, let's begin with you. What did you see?
I was driving in slow traffic near the Pentagon. Just
unusually slow for rush hour?
It seemed to be really backed up. I saw the plane coming in from my left, approximately from the northeast.
Can you describe it? Commercial plane?
It was a commercial American Airlines plane. I distinctly saw the silver color and the AA on the rudder. They're red and blue.
And what happened?
It was coming in very steep and very fast, and I thought immediately, this plane is not landing. It's going to hit. And within seconds, it disappeared just below my line of sight. I heard the explosion. I heard the impact.
So you are an eyewitness to the fact that a plane, in fact, a commercial airliner, struck the U.S. Pentagon.
I did not see it strike the Pentagon. I knew it was very close. But once I got up to the crest of the hill, I looked over and definitely saw black smoke coming from the Pentagon.
And as we speak now, they're still clearing people away from the Pentagon, which is about a 6-story building and, as the name implies, 5-sided. One segment of those, or 2 segments of those 5 sides, are in flames. But it's not expected that total destruction will result, as we have sadly witnessed this morning from the World Trade Towers in New York City.
We are now connected with Michael Scharf, again, a counterterrorism expert. He was with the Counterterrorism Council at the State Department during the Lockerbie investigation. Michael Scharf, what do you make of these attacks, the level of sophistication and coordination needed to carry them out? What does that tell you?
Well, this certainly is the most coordinated attack against the United States that we've ever seen, with the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and even the State Department now being attacked within an hour of each other. But I would like to say that this is basically a low-tech approach. I mean, they're dropping hijacked passenger planes out of the sky, and it does also, I think, indicate that we're misplacing our emphasis on anti-missile defense against rogue regimes when we are so vulnerable to these other kinds of terrorist attacks.
Well, that may be true, although after the fact, it may come as cold comfort that we did that. What happens next in a situation like this, though, Mr. Scharf? Is the United States have any kind of tactical plan to respond to this?
Well, the United States has amazing assets as far as finding out who did this. They have the NSA wiretapping and eavesdropping on thousands and thousands of suspected terrorist cells every moment around the world. And when they get a lead, if they find out who did it, and if it turns out that it's state-supported or sponsored terrorism, which I think might be the case given the level of sophistication and coordination, I think it is likely that George Bush is going to want to respond militarily. He's going to say this is an act of war and we need to respond in kind.
But given the psychology of this thing, this is a colossal victory for the forces of evil. Will they want to sit on this? Won't somebody finally come forward and take credit for it? We don't have to resort to wiretaps to find out who the culprits are.
I think they're better off as far as instilling fear into the hearts and minds of the American people by not coming forward. As long as we don't know who exactly is behind it, we feel more threatened. We don't know who to blame. We don't know what the size and scope of the threat is. And so I think they will quietly. Also, they know that the United States for years now has been preparing its assets in order to be able to attack and respond to terrorists, to hunt them down for prosecution or to assassinate them or take them out militarily, and they're not going to want to admit who they are and tell the world where they are. But they won't rest easy because the United States has a way of finding these things out ultimately.
Well, you sound very certain, but finding the culprit has proved very difficult in the past. Witness what happened in, I guess it was Sudan. The United States has not always been able to track down perpetrators. How definite do U.S. officials need to be? How certain do they need to be before they strike against suspected terrorist organizations?
Well, that's the problem. When you strike against a suspected terrorist organization, you're ultimately dropping bombs on a country. It may not be a country that we're particularly close with, but it's still an act of warfare. And you don't want to do that if there's any chance that there's going to be a mistake. I think we saw when we dropped the bombs on what we thought was a chemical weapons facility in the Sudan in 1998 that turned out to be a pharmaceutical company, that this can really backfire as far as American foreign policy. So they're going to want to be relatively careful about making those determinations, but they don't have to be so careful as proving it in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. If they have a sufficient case against a country as a state supporter, I think this Bush administration will act, and I think the world will support them.
How much support does the United States need from its allies, from other countries, in pursuing the perpetrators and in taking action?
This attack is unprecedented in the history of terrorist acts against any country. And I believe that the other countries around the world, starting with our European allies, are going to very quickly rally around the American flag and support whatever the United States chooses to do to respond.
Just put in perspective for us, you say this is not only the largest terrorist attack against the United States, it is the largest terrorist attack ever in the world. We were speaking again with our security advisor earlier in the hour, Tony Cordesman, who said an incredible amount of sophistication and coordination was required. We know that Osama bin Laden, the Saudi terrorist, is described as having a lot of money, although you suggest that there is likely to have been, or it seems likely to have, state support. What makes you say that?
Well, terrorist groups can't act without either a huge amount of money like Osama bin Laden has, or state support, which will translate into money and also giving passports
and facilities and training grounds and so forth. Osama bin Laden actually has both. Afghanistan has been sheltering him, allowing his troops to use that as a headquarters and training facility. His money allows his perpetrators to get fake passports in order to infiltrate all over the world. And so he is right now the number one terrorist threat because he has all of those different aspects, and he doesn't have a particular country other than Afghanistan and the Taliban that we can target. And so it is very possible that it's Osama bin Laden. But with what's going on in Israel, it could be the Hamas, it could be other Palestinian factions who over years have amassed a great deal of sophistication and military equipment and money that they've gotten from state supporters. And so I wouldn't be too quick to assume that it's bin Laden. There are other possibilities as well.
What is the likelihood that this is domestic, as we saw in Oklahoma City?
I don't think that that's very likely. I think what happened in Oklahoma City was very low tech. It was just the product of a couple of individuals. I don't think any of the groups that are very upset with the government have this kind of sophistication, coordination, or a history of widespread attacks against the American people themselves. And remember, these planes are likely to have been filled with innocent passengers.
That's right.
Is it possible to carry out an attack like this, no matter how sophisticated your technology is and how much money you may have amassed overseas? Is it possible to carry it out without some help from Americans on the ground here?
It is likely that there are inside operators. They could be expatriates from the countries or the groups, people that have been on the ground for a long period of time. I think it would probably be difficult for them to have infiltrated 3 different airports at the same time, smuggled on weapons, were able to hijack aircraft, were able to figure out exact flights and perpetrate this without a wider net of support both in their own countries and in the United States.
Michael Scharf, thank you very much for talking with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Michael Scharf was with the Counterterrorism Council at the State Department, involved in the Lockerbie, Scotland terrorist attack and plane bombing. Thank you very much, Mr. Scharf.
It's 14 hours 52 Universal Time. You're listening to VOA News Now, coming to you from Washington on shortwave affiliate and on the Music Mix Network. We're bringing you special coverage of disasters which have occurred today in New York City, where the World Trade Towers have been utterly destroyed by 2 crashes involving commercial planes. One of them, an American Airlines jet, which was hijacked, we believe, from Boston this morning. And then about 90 minutes later, we have an eyewitness account from one of our own VOA employees that a commercial jet marked again with American Airlines signage was seen to be flown into the Pentagon, the U.S. military headquarters here in Washington.
And that fire at the Pentagon is described now as burning out of control. A plane that officials say was hijacked in the eastern city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, apparently hit a helicopter pad near the U.S. Defense Department building, setting it on fire. Again, the 2 planes that struck the World Trade Center towers in New York City, towers which are now non-existent, those 2 planes reportedly were hijacked in Boston. We do not, however, have confirmation of those hijackings.
And given the nature of the aircraft involved in these explosions today, the U.S. government has ordered a complete ground halt to all U.S. air traffic by commercial aircraft across the country. Never in the history of the nation have we seen this, but we've never seen a day like today either. All commercial air traffic, coast to coast, has been suspended. There is no air traffic permitted inside or to or from the United States.
In addition to that, all federal agencies in Washington, D.C. have been shut down. We should mention that our own studios are here in Washington. We are in a studio that has no windows to the outside, so we can't tell you right now what things look like, but we can tell you that if the fire is as big as it seems, we are told that it is burning out of control at the Pentagon. It is likely that smoke from that fire is visible to the naked eye. Rob Sivak, our own VOA science and agriculture correspondent, is on the Washington Mall, we're told. Rob, earlier there were reports that there were fires on the mall.
Barbara, I saw no evidence of any fires on the mall. It actually had an oddly business as usual kind of look under a cloudless sky. There were lots of tourists milling about on the mall. Certainly there was a lot of confusion about what was going on. Everyone had heard, of course, of the tragedy in New York and had begun to hear about what was happening here in Washington. And then many of the people turned out to be evacuees from the FBI building and all of the federal buildings that line the mall, the museums, everything had been closed, and now we have park police coming and ordering the clearing of the National Mall. All the tourists and people who have been evacuated from their buildings are being told to find some way to get home. The metro, the subway system in Washington, at last report, was still operating. And I guess under heavy guard, perhaps, there is going to be an effort to get all the people who are milling about on the mall home and somewhere other than in the center of Washington, D.C. The park police have set up a command center on the central lawn, the nation's capital, and I think they're going to be trying to monitor and offer some security to the buildings around this area. So that's the situation right now. It's a beautiful day out here, but there is a sense of fear. We've spoken with a lot of the tourists here. Ironically, a woman that we ran into from Northern Ireland. She said she's accustomed to bombing, but nothing like this she just couldn't believe that something like this would happen in Washington, D.C.
All right, Rob, thank you very much. If you're staying out there, we will be checking back with you as we progress in our coverage of attacks, apparently terrorist attacks, on both New York City's World Trade Center towers, both of which have collapsed, two of the world's largest buildings. Also, an airplane attack on the Pentagon, apparently coordinated attacks, hijackings of American airline commercial jets from different cities, hijacked from different cities, striking at a couple of major centers in the United States, causing the shutdown of all air traffic in the entire country.
President Bush is said to be returning to Washington from a domestic political trip to Florida. The U.S. Secretary of State, who was in Peru this morning, is said to be on his way back to the United States. There is significant disruption to U.S. telecommunications across the country as a result of millions of Americans awakening this morning, picking up their telephones, trying to reach loved ones in New York City and Washington, trying to change travel arrangements, as this ground halt has resulted in a total freeze on all commercial air traffic across the United States. The stock markets are closed on Wall Street. We are told the price of oil has spiked $4 a barrel, and that stock values have plunged in many of the European bourses in at least the first reaction to what's happened. The World Trade Towers were headquarters for many international businesses, many of them Asian and European. This is likely to disrupt commerce for several weeks to come among many key sectors of U.S. and international business concerns. And of course, most important of all, we have tremendous loss of life this morning as a result of the collapse of the two twin towers in New York City, as well as the passengers aboard those two commercial jet craft who were apparently hijacked.
And there is word that there's been a fourth explosion at the World Trade Center towers in New York. Both towers have collapsed after planes crashed into both of them. The first explosion happened shortly before 9 a.m., with the second one about 20 minutes later. In another development, federal aviation officials say a large commercial airliner crashed near the eastern industrial city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was not clear whether that plane was hijacked. Earlier, we had word that the plane that crashed into the Pentagon had been hijacked from Pittsburgh. Perhaps that story will be revised. In the meantime, world leaders are expressing horror and sadness at today's terrorist attacks in the United States. French President Jacques Chirac says the people of France are entirely at the sides of the American people. He said he feels a horrified sadness at the news of the attacks at New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington. British Prime Minister Tony Blair says he is terribly shocked.
And that's a look at what's been happening this morning on September 11th, another date that will live in infamy in U.S. history, certainly in the 21st century. We will bring you continuing coverage of this tragic story as it continues to develop throughout the day. I'm Russell Woodgates with Barbara Klein in Washington. This is VOA News Now.
It's 15 hours Universal Time from Washington. This is VOA News Now. This is a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet.
There have been a series of apparent terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. During the next hour, we'll bring the latest on the story.
Hello, I'm Susan Yawkey.
And I'm Sarah Williams. Stay with us here on VOA News Now.
Let's begin with a review of what is happening here in the United States. There have been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in New York City and here in Washington, including at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. 2 airplanes crashed into both towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. Both towers collapsed a short time later. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. Witnesses said a plane was flying extremely low just before the blast, but it was not immediately clear if the plane crashed into the building. Smoke was also seen on the Washington Mall, which spans the distance between the U.S. Capitol building and the White House. And many federal government buildings in Washington have been evacuated. Traffic in Washington was gridlocked with people fleeing in droves. Aviation authorities have grounded all airplane takeoffs around the country. The World Trade Center was bombed in a terrorist attack in 1993, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 others.
Shortly after the attacks today, President Bush spoke on television and radio.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
That is President Bush.
Now we go to an interview with Neil Livingston by our correspondent David. It's 15 hours Universal Time from Washington. This is VOA News Now. This is a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet.
There have been a series of apparent terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. During the next hour, we'll bring the latest on the story.
Hello, I'm Susan Yawkey.
And I'm Sarah Williams. Stay with us here on VOA News Now.
Let's begin with a review of what is happening here in the United States. There have been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in New York City and here in Washington, including at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. 2 airplanes crashed into both towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. Both towers collapsed a short time later. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. Witnesses said a plane was flying extremely low just before the blast, but it was not immediately clear if the plane crashed into the building. Smoke was also seen on the Washington Mall, which spans the distance between the U.S. Capitol building and the White House. And many federal government buildings in Washington have been evacuated. Traffic in Washington was gridlocked with people fleeing in droves. Aviation authorities have grounded all airplane takeoffs around the country. The World Trade Center was bombed in a terrorist attack in 1993, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 others.
Shortly after the attacks today, President Bush spoke on television and radio.
Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
That is President Bush.
Now we go to an interview with Neil Livingston by our correspondent David Borgita to talk about the nature of the terrorist attack.
This is David Borgita in Washington. With me is Dr. Neil Livingston, who is a terrorism expert. He is chairman and CEO of Global Options, a Washington, D.C. risk management group, and he's also the author of 9 books on terrorism. Thank you for joining us, sir, on this very hectic day in Washington. Sir, tell us what you know about any groups that may or may have claimed responsibility for this, and what is some appropriate background for our listeners and viewers?
Well, it would appear that the attack probably originated in the Middle East. I know that our law enforcement and intelligence people right now are working on that assumption because generally those are the only groups with the wherewithal to carry out this kind of massive attack. And certainly with suicide bombers, in effect, the people who have hijacked these aircrafts and gone to their deaths, that's why the only other group in the world that we would have any substantial concern about right now would be the Colombian drug cartel, simply because Fabio Ochoa was recently extradited to the United States. But we don't think that that would be as likely in this case. So we have a number of Palestinian groups that have claimed credit. We certainly are concerned about Osama bin Laden. He has threatened repeatedly to attack the United States again.
So to be clear, this is roughly an hour and a half or so after the attacks began, and we aren't clear in terms of an investigation as to who is responsible for this, and that's your speculation, sir. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that this is a coordinated attack given its widespread feel here in a number of different venues.
This is the most well-coordinated terrorist attack we've ever seen. This is our nightmare scenario that we've exercised and looked at over and over again, which would be a multiple attacks on a multiplicity of targets and a multiplicity of cities, which are well orchestrated and carried out with precision. And we didn't have any answers for that, and I think the only thing that you can say is that we are at war right now.
Are we prepared to move forward from this point on, sir? And what would you envision in the days ahead in terms of an investigation?
Well, I think this will not be done as a court probative investigation. This is a military and intelligence investigation as well as a law enforcement investigation. The United States has been attacked probably with a loss of life maybe as great or greater than Pearl Harbor. And so I think the United States will respond accordingly. All of our planes are grounded. Our economy is at a standstill today. This will have an impact on our economy. And President Bush will be called upon right now to take very strong action as soon as we have a reasonable presumption as to who did this.
You've been in this business a long time. Has the United States been organized and prepared for this?
No, this is the thing that we've been saying for 20 years. We had to be prepared for, but we're not prepared for this, as you can see today. And but that's one of the costs of an open society, is that we have great vulnerabilities. The problem is that we've allowed terrorism to fester in many parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, without the appropriate response in the past. And so we've emboldened the terrorists that they could strike at the very heart of the United States, at the Pentagon, the White House, the Capitol, the World Trade Center towers. They're all very strong symbols of our superiority in the world today.
And I'll leave you with one last question. I know you have a tight time frame, but tell us the very nature of terrorism is that it does strike fear into the hearts and minds of the average citizen. Can Americans respond to this in a way that you think is healthy? It is obviously a very dramatic day for Americans. How do you expect Americans to recover from this sort of thing and move forward in terms of living their lives and going to the places they want to go to and so forth?
Well, Americans are going to be terribly traumatized like this, the way they were by Pearl Harbor. And I think until we take the necessary steps against the countries that have harbored the terrorists and against the terrorists themselves, that there will be no comfort level in the American people, so long as the people who promulgated these acts are still on the loose.
Thank you, Dr. Neil Livingston. We appreciate your time. I'm David Borgita in Washington. Dr. Livingston is the chairman and CEO of Global Options, a Washington, D.C. risk management group, and the author of 9 books on terrorism.
If you're just joining us, this is a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet from Washington following a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in New York City and here in Washington. Those targets included the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I'm Susan Yawkey, along with Sarah Williams.
Well, shortly after the planes crashed into the World Trade Center, terrorism expert Brian Jenkins discussed the nature of the attack.
Well, I think we should know very, very quickly. There should be information on the basis of information that would come into air traffic control about what planes were in the area, any broadcasts that may have been made from the cockpit. I mean, this is close to three major commercial airports. This is crowded airspace, and so there would be very, very quickly some information regarding the flight.
Are you aware, as a terrorist expert who we have spoken to many times here on our program, of any specific threats of this nature having been made against the U.S.?
Certainly, I haven't heard of any specific threat, but one has to keep in mind that there has been, for quite some time now, a continuing volume of threats. There are continuing alerts about the possibility of terrorist attacks directed against the United States, abroad or potentially here on American soil. So that's a continuing thing. I mean, obviously, if there were anything specific that people had, they would take steps to thwart the attack, as we have in the past when we've had information about terrorist attacks, been able to take some protective measures.
How do you expect us to receive any word from the perpetrators?
We may not receive any word. I mean, the problem that we face here is that in years past, terrorists were very quick to claim responsibility for their actions, but in more recent years, particularly in some of these more horrendous incidents, we haven't seen a claim made specifically by any group. They leave it, in a sense, to our imagination to try to figure out who is behind it. They're satisfied by carrying out the operation itself, not particularly concerned with taking credit.
Well, tell me, how would you characterize this particular attack? I mean, there have been bombs before, suicide bombings we see in other parts of the world, the Oklahoma City bombing, which many people initially thought was a terrorist attack, the bombing of the World Trade Centers themselves in 1993. But this, 2 airplanes, it appears, crashing in to these World Trade towers, this seems a huge step.
It is something that we have worried about before. It is unprecedented, but we have worried before about the possibility that hijackers might seize control of an airliner and fly it into a populated center. There have been threats in the past, not related to this particular event, but in years past, when planes were hijacked, there were threats that the hijackers might fly it in, crash it into a populated area. So the action I mean, certainly terrorists in years ago have thought about such things, but it's clearly unprecedented, and especially in this case when there are two planes flying into the same set of buildings.
Yes, it seems that it for whoever is behind this, it required enormous planning and coordination to do this.
That would be a safe presumption. I mean, I think it is safe to say it's too early to speculate as to the details of who may be responsible, but I think it's safe to assume that this is a coordinated action. This is not happenstance. The two planes crash into the World Trade Center within minutes of one another.
That's terrorism expert Brian Jenkins speaking from California with VOA's Barbara Klein and Russ Woodgates.
One of the targets today was the Pentagon building here in Washington. Earlier it was described as burning out of control. A plane that officials say was hijacked in the eastern city of Pittsburgh apparently hit a helicopter pad near the U.S. Defense Department building, setting it on fire. That was our early report. Right now we have our correspondent Andrew Barrick out there near the Pentagon reporting to us. Andrew, what do you see?
Well, I'm right here at the MCI building in Pentagon City, and a security man is asking me to hold up and not talk to you, but I'm going to continue to go live. What I saw was I was on the subway going to work, and people were talking about the New York City Trade Center bombings, and we turned around, we looked, we saw a flash of light and suddenly smoke billowing from the Pentagon area. Well, we didn't know, of course, it was the Pentagon area at the time. The subway operator came on the air, said that the subway car was now going to stop at the next stop, which was Pentagon City, which is several miles from the Pentagon, and there was an orderly evacuation. But there are people obviously were nervous. Some people were crying, and people immediately went to their cell phones and started making calls. Many, of course, could not get through. He's cutting off the phone right now. Are you?
I'm still with you, Andrew. I'm still there, Andrew.
The security person here is not allowing. For some reason, he's trying to disrupt my call.
Andrew, what about the emergency response? Did you see crews returning to the scene?
I saw the ambulance head to the scene, and I saw helicopters.
Apparently, he was disconnected at that time. That's our correspondent, Andrew Barrick. He's reporting out near the Pentagon, which was one of the targets of today's strikes.
We are joined now in the studio by Kim Elliott, who is the host of VOA's Communications World. And he's going to be discussing us the effect of this attack on the communications and broadcasting media here in the United States. Hello, Kim. This is a very unique event. The United States has never seen anything like this. What kind of an impact does this have for communications here in the U.S.?
Yes, well, as a side note to the real tragedy, the main tragedy, a lot of communications and broadcasting have been affected by this. If you remember the pictures of the World Trade Center towers, on top of those were antennas for TV stations and FM stations in the New York area. I asked some of my friends on the internet who live in the New York area to tell me if they can still get the signals. Ralph Brandy, who lives in New Jersey near New York City, told me that all the VHF TV stations in New York are off the air except for WCBS Channel 2, which must be at a different location. I imagine the stations are still available on cable, but regular broadcasts are off, and I'm sure FM is affected too. They're also telling me that they're not able to get the webcast of VOA News now. I'm sure the server is overwhelmed as a lot of people are checking in, trying to hear our news coverage, as well as news coverage from a lot of other webcasts, news-oriented webcasts, especially people who would like to listen in on what's going on in New York and in Washington via webcasts.
It was interesting as we were watching the television coverage that some of the stations that were reporting on it at the time were losing their signals, losing the ability to talk to the reporters on the scene as the towers were being destroyed by the fire.
Absolutely. This is also a big day for any radio and TV stations which are news-oriented, especially the all-news radio stations, and I'm getting tape of those stations and trying to get some actuality of that because it's fascinating. They're trying to guide people home. A lot of people in Washington are sent home now, but there's heavy traffic, and so all news stations have the responsibility of getting them home.
And even here at VOA, we've had trouble reaching some of our correspondents in the field because the phone lines are out. Sometimes there's no even dial tone, or you get one of those messages that the line is busy. So it's affecting everybody.
I have to say, though, the email is working well, and in fact, if anybody has any news tips, especially about broadcasting scene or anything, you can send them to newsnow@voanews.com or to me at CW for Communications World at voanews.com, and audio excerpts as attachments would be very much appreciated.
Sometimes when there's a lot of activity on the internet, though, it tends to get jammed up. Are we going to have that problem today?
Well, the websites are taking a hit right now. But the email is getting through. So email is a much more robust internet medium than the World Wide Web.
That's very interesting. I don't mean to interrupt you there, Susan, but actually, I tried earlier today getting on the website of one of our competitors, the BBC, and it was I wasn't able to do it. I just think that it was so heavily trafficked because of this story. And that's, of course, based in London. So
it's interesting how the internet has given us one more tool to cover a horrific, humongous story.
Right.
Story like this.
No, it really has. Kim, I was also going to ask you, and this is such an evolving story, you might not know about this, but have there been any problems with, say, communications here in Washington, anything similar to what happened in New York? I know that, you probably are not able to talk about military communications. It's highly secretive. But say any local communications. Has there been any word about that?
Well, I've heard that also cell calls in this area are pretty well jammed up. Regular telephone seems to be working, but the cell circuits are pretty much jammed up. And also for BBC, you mentioned that just a minute ago. If you want to get BBC News, you might actually have to dust off your shortwave radio to do that.
This has got to be the biggest story I can remember ever here in the United States. Do you all recall anything comparable?
No. And it's
well, I was saying to somebody in the newsroom earlier today when I saw pictures of Manhattan with smoke billowing out. I've never seen anything like this, except this is before I was born, of course. But Pearl Harbor was the last time I can ever remember seeing pictures of a part of the United States actually under attack and seeing smoke. And this is, unfortunately, though, this is something that people in other countries have had to deal with quite a bit. We Americans have been very lucky previous to now that we've been able to avoid this kind of thing.
And you'll remember the reaction after Pearl Harbor. It woke the sleeping tiger, so to speak, and it'll be interesting to see what the analysts say about this, what sort of reaction it'll have in the long term. Just to refresh everybody's memory, if you'd like to stay with us, Kim, you're welcome to. This is a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet from Washington. It follows a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in New York City and here in Washington. We do not have full details of what is going on. Fires are still raging, and 2 airplanes crashed into both towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. One of the 2 towers collapsed a short time later, and another one fell a little after that. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. Witnesses said a plane was flying extremely low just before the blast, but it was not immediately clear if the plane crashed into the building or a nearby area. Also, smoke was seen on the mall, so there's a lot going on here in the United States.
And we will bring it to you as quickly as we can. Obviously, with such an evolving situation, it is changing minute by minute, so we can talk about what we know, and as soon as we get more information, we will be bringing it to you today. Well, certainly this crisis has had an enormous impact on world, or at least on American financial markets. Wall Street, and of course the World Trade Center is in that area of New York's financial capital, has been closed. Much of the area around the financial center has been evacuated. Trading was actually suspended on the New York Stock Exchange, and in addition, the NASDAQ stock market has been considering whether to continue work today. However, the American Stock Exchange and the New York Mercantile Exchange did announce that they are closed today. In addition, in Chicago, in the Midwest, the Chicago Board of Trade also suspended all trading during the morning, in addition because of the concerns about the attacks.
It'll be interesting to see this ripple effect around the world as a result of these attacks.
It will be, yes.
Now I believe we have on the line Michael Pangia. He's an aviation expert, and he joins us on the line live right now. Mr. Pangia, this is Susan Yockey along with Sarah Williams in Washington. Hello, sir.
Yes.
Is there anything you can tell us about these attacks today?
Well, I don't think I could say anything any more than anybody else has said. It came to me as everybody else, like everybody else, as a complete shock. This is more than just an aviation disaster. I understand that everything has been closed. The plane that hit the Pentagon, I understand, came out of Dulles. A lot of the information can be wrong at this time, but I understand it came out of Dulles Airport, which is only 2 minutes away from that Pentagon. So it's quite easy for that to happen on a hijacked airplane. I understand now that my call up to where I live up in Capitol Hill, that there was an explosion up there of some type, which I think was a car bomb, and that there are jet fighters that have been scrambled that are guarding the area. So this is, as much as I know, I could probably only add to the confusion at this point.
Well, it is amazing to me that this could possibly happen. I try to go through the airport with just a video camera and I get stopped. I have to run the machine. How could anything like this happen?
This has obviously been a very, very well-planned, coordinated attack that had been planned for some time. Yeah, we all say how it could happen. Everybody's talking about Star Wars defense and missiles and things like that when something could be rowed up the East River on a rowboat.
Well, do you know how was a plane able to get so close to the Pentagon? I mean, isn't that
very easily. In fact, when you approach National Airport, and I fly my own plane in and out, and you approach National Airport, you make a sharp left turn when you land to the south, and you set down on the runway. 15 seconds, literally 15 seconds off of that approach course from National Airport, you can be over the Pentagon, over the White House, over the Capitol, anywhere you want to be. And I doubt very much whether missile protection could catch it in time. Coming out of Dulles Airport is the same thing. The Pentagon is literally, I'd say, 20 seconds away. If you took off and headed the plane right to the Pentagon, it would be a matter of under a minute before you reach the Pentagon. So that's how it could happen.
Being a pilot yourself and being an expert in this area, we all know that the average ticket holder goes through security checks to get on the plane. What about the pilot and the co-pilot? How secure are their entry onto the plane?
Well, it's fairly secure, and crew members know each other. This had to be, and this is all guess and speculation at this point, but some passengers get on there and, maybe take over and have a pilot on board to take over to fly this airplane rather than even coerce the legitimate pilot. Something like this had to be planned, particularly since the two airplanes up in New York were so accurate in hitting their targets. Even if the legitimate pilot is coerced, they could very, very easily swerve it into the river and things of that sort. So this had to be something more than just somebody holding a gun to somebody's head.
Would it be easy for somebody in a uniform to get on that plane as a pilot?
It might be. I don't think it'd be easy, but anything could happen. Any system could. The terror of this thing, when you look at it in the long range, is what we're willing to do to our own freedoms to stop this, and that is really the harm that we're going to see in this country for the next 10 years. Is the amount of freedoms and constrictions that the average citizen must undergo in order to protect themselves, and that is really the horror, even further beyond continuing horror of this type of thing.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. We certainly appreciate you speaking with us live on the line. That's Michael Pangia. He's an aviation expert.
And the leading news story we're following, of course, at this hour. U.S. authorities have gone on the highest alert coast to coast, halting all air traffic, evacuating high-profile buildings, and tightening security at government and military installations. Under orders from the Federal Aviation Administration, airports nationwide have halted all outbound flights. They were keeping their runways open for incoming planes. All emergency rescue personnel in the New York and Washington, D.C. areas have been pressed into service, and New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says a tremendous number of lives have been lost in the apparent terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center Twin Towers. There is no official word on the number of casualties.
For reaction to the violence from the general public, our correspondent Jim Teeple grabbed his tape machine and went out to the Capitol Mall right outside VOA, and he got this reaction from the general public to today's violence.
We're here with National Farmers Union. Our group is from North Dakota, and we were supposed to make some visits to congressmen today to do some lobbying, and all of a sudden we heard whistles blowing and people saying, people running, and they told us to go in the building, then they told us to evacuate the building, and thought we heard something that the Pentagon was hit.
Are you scared? How do you feel?
It's scary and also concerned about what our families back in North Dakota, if they hear something and know that we're here in D.C., what's going on.
What was the atmosphere up in the office buildings? Was there panic? Was there nervousness? How would you describe it?
It was pretty calm, really. They just told everybody to get in. Well, they were running down the streets when they told us to all go in the buildings. We seen a bunch of people on top of the Capitol, and all of a sudden they disappeared. I don't know if they had heard that the Pentagon got hit or what.
It seems like we're not as prepared as we were led to believe, and I think we need to do something about that right away.
I think maybe the American people will wake up to the fact that now we need to definitely increase the defense budget. We've been aware of terrorists for years, and we think we're indestructible. We're not. We need to do something we have to do something that's going to make a difference and prevent this from happening. There's got to be a way. There's got to be a plan. We have to unite. We got to be behind the president and this government. And we've known of terrorist groups for years, and many of them. And the first, obviously, the place they want to get is the Capitol, Washington. Where after all, here's the seat of our government.
We have to have our president protected. We have to have our great nation protected, and this cannot go on any longer. We must protect our people, but more importantly, at this point, our president and the government.
We have to unite. We have to unite as they did in other times in our history, like World War II. We have to unite. We have to bond. We have to really become one nation again, as we have from the beginning of our history.
Hi, can I get your reaction to what's happening up here today?
Disbelief that it was, really happening. I mean, you hear about movies and terrorist attacks and open society. But I mean, if you have a terrorist that's willing to kill themselves to kill others, how are you going to stop it? If they can hit the Pentagon, who's safe?
What do you think the reaction of the United States should be when they find out who did this?
Massive retaliation. Just like the Israelis. I mean, you can't live with terrorism. I think the United States should just, excuse my expression, kick ass.
I think it's pretty scary, but I think you could have expected it considering what's been going on in the political situation and everyone's feelings with the United States.
What do you think the reaction of the United States should be when they find out who carried these acts out?
I think they should get the people, and I think they should make them pay.
A sampling of opinion from the streets of Washington, the nation's capital. Earlier, President Bush called the crashes in New York an apparent terrorist attack. The president, on a visit to the southern state of Florida, says he has ordered a full-scale investigation. In his words, he's going to hunt down those who committed the attack, a feeling many Americans support at this time. If you've just tuned in, this is a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet from Washington. Here's the story we're following. There's been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in the United States, including the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and State Department. Many people have been killed, but there are no exact casualty figures. 2 airplanes crashed into both 110-story towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. Both towers collapsed later. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. A witness told VOA that he saw an American Airlines passenger jet flying extremely low and fast just before the blast, but it was not immediately clear if the plane crashed into the building. An airliner also crashed outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is not known if that crash was related to the other incidents. Smoke was seen on the Washington Mall, which spans the distance between the U.S. Capitol building and the White House. Many federal government buildings in Washington have been evacuated, and traffic in the city is gridlocked with people fleeing in droves. And as we mentioned, President Bush called the crashes in New York an apparent terrorist attack and vowed to hunt down those responsible. Aviation authorities have grounded all airplane takeoffs from around the country. And you will recall that the World Trade Center was bombed in a terrorist attack in 1993, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 others. In Washington, I'm Susan Yawkey, along with Sarah Williams.
And we're joined now in the studio by VOA's Adam Phillips, who was just in the vicinity of the White House, and he heard an explosion. Welcome, Adam. Could you describe what happened, what you heard in that area?
Well, the streets were full of chaos. People were talking very, very loudly. They looked very agitated. There was a lot of sighs. People were crying, dabbing their handkerchiefs. And all of a sudden, there was a loud explosion. I can't say for sure if it was a bomb or not, but it sounded close enough to a bomb to panic very many people. And I actually got a little bit of tape of the reaction of that, if you'd like to hear it.
Yes.
What was that?
What do you hear?
I don't know. I heard something like, you didn't hear that?
Yeah.
I heard that.
Yeah.
What is that? What is that?
I need you to push back.
Can we get our cars?
Thank you. I need you to push back. I need you to push back, please.
That was the sound just, I guess it was about 45 minutes ago. So it's 25 minutes of 11 now or so. It was about 45 minutes ago I heard that.
Well, Adam, I know originally you were from the city of New York, and unfortunately, one of the horrific things that have happened today were the explosion, the destruction of the World Trade Center in the city's financial district. Could you describe to us a bit about what that area of the city is like, about how many people are there at that time of day? I guess it happened around 9 o'clock this morning, New York time.
Well, that was sort of the heart of the financial district, a little bit off the famous Wall Street, which is sort of the financial center of the world, arguably. And so there are, tens and tens of thousands of people there. I don't know exactly how many people, but at 9 o'clock in the morning, most of them can be presumed to have just arrived at work.
Excuse me, Adam.
Yes.
I don't mean to interrupt. Please hold that thought, but I've just been handed an urgent story. There has now been a 4th explosion at the World Trade Center towers in New York City. Both towers, as we mentioned, collapsed this morning after planes crashed into both of them. The first explosion happened shortly after 9 a.m. local time, with the second 20 seconds later. And in another development, while I've got the mic for a moment, federal aviation officials say a large commercial airliner crashed near the eastern industrial city of Pittsburgh. It's not clear whether that plane was also hijacked. Please continue your thoughts.
Well, everyone had just gotten to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's sort of the beginning of the official workday from 9 to 5, and so people were arriving, people were ready to go. No one had any idea what was going to happen, and kaboom, it's obviously a huge building, and not only were people within the building and within the plane hurt, but of course, this is very dangerous to the people on the street and on the buildings below. Since everything is below that, it's one of the tallest buildings in the world.
And in that area of New York, so many people work in that area. They're dependent on things like elevators. The buildings are so enormously high. If you've been in any of those, the World Trade, I've not personally been in that building, but I have been in the Empire State Building, and I've been in the Chrysler Building. Very tall buildings like that are so affected by something like this.
Right. People are stuck on the top floor. People who aren't hurt or dead or injured are stuck on the top floors. And then there's the problem of the height, of course, and the access to get there. So everything is happening all at once, and I think that it's a terrible tragedy, and we'll have to see how it develops.
Okay, thank you very much.
So
That's
much for coming by
VOA's
the
Adam
studio.
Phillips.
Thank you.
To review, there has been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in the United States, including the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and State Department. Many people have been killed, but there are no exact casualty figures. And also, we'll mention at this time that U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has canceled his planned visit to Colombia and will rush back to Washington following apparent terrorist attacks in the United States. And New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says a tremendous number of lives have been lost in the apparent terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center in New York. U.S. authorities have gone on the highest alert coast to coast, halting all air traffic, evacuating high-profile buildings, and tightening security at government and military installations. Under orders from the Federal Aviation Administration, airports nationwide have halted all outbound flights. They were keeping their runways open for incoming planes. All emergency rescue personnel in New York and Washington, D.C. areas have been pressed into service. Right now, as you can imagine, it's gridlock out there on the roads, and VOA's Barbara Klein and Paul Westphaling have this report on what's going on.
There must be 1,000 people standing outside. The building has been completely evacuated. Police have cordoned off the building. They've evacuated the Capitol building as well, but they've evacuated Union Station and the large Postal Museum building right across the street from it. Everyone is standing around outside. They can't go into these buildings. Police will not let them anywhere near the buildings.
What's the mood? What do you hear people saying?
I would say, in a word, chaotic. I'm looking at the traffic, and it is bumper to bumper at a standstill. One person told me that he was trying to get out of Washington. He just gave up and parked his car on the side of the road because traffic is not going anywhere. People are milling around in somewhat of a state of confusion, not knowing exactly what to do. On the one hand, some people have told me they understand the need for this national emergency procedure, as it's called. But on the other hand, they're a little miffed that they can't go anywhere, and some people are saying this may be an overreaction. Nevertheless, you can't get into any of these buildings, and people are standing out in the bright sunlight waiting for something to happen.
In addition to travelers being stuck there outside Union Station, what about the people who work at Union Station and, the train conductors, the people who run the shops there?
Well, I tried to get into Union Station myself to catch a train to go to New York, and I noticed all of these people come running out of the subway and the area that leads down to the Amtrak station. They are being told to get out, and no one is being allowed in.
Clearly, you know that all air traffic throughout the country has been halted.
I'm also told that you cannot get out of Washington on any of the bridges that go out of town. The tunnels that go out of town have been closed down. That's one reason for the massive gridlock that I'm looking at now. There are police everywhere, undercover agents everywhere. People are directing traffic, and they're standing around wondering what happens next.
So these bridges that are closed down to get outside of the city, of course, a lot of the people who work for the government and certainly any businesses and law firms in the city need to take those bridges to get home. Have they been closed because of traffic is so heavy or what?
No, what I have been told by one of the security agents down here is that they have been told because of the possibility of perhaps a plane crashing into one of them. National Airport, of course, is right near the Potomac, and there are 3, maybe 4 bridges that cross within 2 or 3 miles of the airport. So I presume that's a safety precaution as well.
How heavy is a police presence around Union Station?
You can't go 50 feet without finding someone either in uniform or with the, telltale talking into his shirt sleeve collar, or the shirt sleeve. Everyone is being told what to do by police. There is a heavy security presence, not only police, but security from the other branches of government as well.
What have you been told to do, Paul?
I've been told to move it. Whenever I go, I'm standing right next to a hedge about 100 meters from the train station, and I've been told to get out of the way, don't come anywhere near the train station. I've identified myself as a reporter, and they said, well, I'm glad you are, but leave.
That's correspondent Paul Westphaling speaking with our own Barbara Klein. Right now, live on the line, we have Mark Wolfson of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Some people call that FEMA. Mr. Wolfson, thank you for joining us today. Mr. Wolfson, are you on the line? Do we have Mr. Wolfson? Our engineers right now are trying to reach him. He's apparently there, but they can't seem to get him up on the road. Right now, though...
we might be having another guest, Mr. Peter Raven Hansen, who's a professor of law at George Washington University.
We do seem to have Mr. Wolfson at this moment. Is that correct, Tracy? Do we have Mr. Wolfson up?
This is Mark Wolfson.
Hi, I'm glad you could join us. Sorry about that technical problem we were having.
That's okay, I'm here.
You have a very busy day.
It is.
What is going on right now?
Here. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. What is going on right now with your agency?
Well, the FEMA Operations Center here in Washington has been activated. We're on full alert. We have our liaison staff that works with the FBI in place over at the FBI Command Center. And we are, there have been a number of high-level conference meetings that have been going on this morning. We have activated the Federal Response Plan, and we are making sure that all the resources that are needed to respond to the situation as it develops are quickly made available.
Hello, Mr. Wolfson, are you still there?
I'm here.
Great. What is involved in the Federal Response Plan?
Well, the Federal Response Plan has been in place now for since the early 90s, and it's a plan that we use for all types of disasters and emergencies when it reaches a level where the federal government needs to assist. And several years ago, a special terrorism annex was added to the plan so that we would clearly outline which agencies and departments would have responsibility for what types of responses.
We are also joined now by Mr. James Witt, who is the former director of FEMA. Mr. Witt, has there been any instance like this? Is this something that, FEMA is prepared to handle an attack like this or attacks like this? Hello, Mr. Witt?
Mr. Wolfson, are you still with us?
I'm here.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. You must be overloaded today with all this going on. Can you tell us the situation out there? Details?
Well, the situation here at FEMA headquarters is we are still open and operating. As you may have already reported, most federal employees in the Washington, D.C. area have been sent home, but all essential personnel at FEMA are still on the job operating. We have an operations center that's up and running. We have a mission to carry out, and we are coordinating the federal response to the consequences of the situation that's occurred today.
How big is the situation that you're trying to deal with?
Well, the reports are still coming in, and needless to say, the most severe damage has occurred up in Manhattan, in New York City, with the collapse of the two towers. We do have 4 of our urban search and rescue task forces which have been activated. These are the same task forces that were used after the bombing in Oklahoma City to search the building there, and these are made up of firefighters and paramedics and structural engineers who are specially trained to work in that type of environment.
Do you have any phone numbers people can call if they need help?
Not at this point. I don't have any numbers for them right now. No.
And I was wondering specifically, are you providing anything for civilians that are out there?
Well, the response to a situation like this in the New York City area it's primarily being directed and handled by the local authorities, the New York City Fire Department and Police Department, and the city itself has its own emergency management office. And we are in the background to support them, but they are on the front lines to ensure the safety and security of the public.
Of course, there's no way to be prepared for events like this, but we have been very cautious lately about terrorists. Were you somewhat prepared?
We have been working, the key agencies have been working for some time now on the plans to coordinate response to situations like this, and we all know each other well. The connections are there, the plans are in place, and we're right now very busy implementing them.
Well, I'll let you get back to work then. Thank you for joining us. That's Mark Wolfson with the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Well, in the Middle East, VOA's Greg Lamont gave the news about the terrorist attacks to PLO spokeswoman Hanan Ashrawi.
Oh, God, I hope not. I hope not. What group? I doubt that, seriously. I don't see how they can do this. I really don't. I don't know. I don't see that. This is awful. This is horrible. I can't. No. I hope not, and I can't believe it. I don't know. Of course, I hope it's not Palestinian. I don't think it is. And I don't think that these actions are actions that can be condoned or accepted by anybody. This is horrible. It's horrific. I don't want to comment on this because I really don't even want to link Palestinians to such actions, frankly speaking.
That is PLO spokeswoman Hanan Ashrawi. Well, meanwhile, around the world leaders are expressing horror and sadness at today's terrorist attacks in the United States. French President Jacques Chirac says the people of France are entirely at the sides of the American people. Mr. Chirac says he feels a horrified sadness at the news of the terrorist attacks at New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington. British Prime Minister Tony Blair says he is terribly shocked by the terrorist attacks. He describes the attacks as the most terrible, shocking event and offered his condolences to President Bush. Russian President Vladimir Putin also has conveyed his deepest condolences to the American people, condemning both attacks in New York and Washington. And German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder has called a meeting of the Federal Security Council after the wave of terrorist attacks here in the U.S. The council will meet later today in Berlin to discuss the response of German authorities to the attack. The Federal Security Council is made up of key ministries. Meanwhile, the U.S. Embassy in Berlin has declined to comment on what, if any, measures it is taking in Germany.
I'm Susan Yockey along with Sarah Williams in Washington, and you're listening to a special report on VOA radio, television, and the Internet. If you're just joining us, here's a summary of what's going on. There's been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks here in the United States, including the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and State Department. Many people have been killed, but there are no exact casualty figures at this time. 2 airplanes crashed into both 110-story towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. Both towers collapsed later. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. A witness told VOA that he saw an American Airlines passenger jet flying extremely low and fast just before the blast, but it was not immediately clear if the plane crashed into the building. An airliner also crashed outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is not known if that crash was related to the other incidents. Smoke was seen on the Washington Mall, which spans the distance between the U.S. Capitol building and the White House. Many federal government buildings in Washington have been evacuated, and traffic in the city is gridlocked with people fleeing in droves. President Bush called the crash in New York an apparent terrorist attack. Aviation authorities have grounded all airplane takeoffs around the country.
And we are joined now on the line by Peter Raven Hansen, who's a professor of law at George Washington University. He is an expert in counterterrorism. Was there any indication that such a thing could happen?
I'm not aware of any. Most of the scenarios that the Federal Emergency and Anti-Terrorist Forces have dealt with involve weapons of mass destruction. I don't even know if they have practiced in response to an attack by hijacked planes like this. And I certainly am not aware that the intelligence community had picked up the possibility of this kind of attack.
Well, how would American and international authorities deal with this kind of an attack? Because this was clearly pretty carefully planned.
Yeah, the scale and the professionalism, the need for pilots, the navigation skills, and the coordination suggest that this isn't some small cell, and that may offer some hope of tracing the perpetrators. But how they deal with them is going to be a difficult issue. If they're not state-sponsored, there's the question whether you go after the host country where they are located, if we can find them. And we've never been able to find Osama bin Laden himself, if he was involved. And in any case, I suppose it's premature for me to mention a name of any kind, since we made an error in the Oklahoma City bombing and looking abroad for the perpetrator. But I would think they would have a better chance here than in some prior incidents because of the scale of the attack.
Who would be some of the, we don't always want to get speculative, but who would be some of the more likely suspects, do you think?
Well, I would doubt that this would be some internal militia group because of the sophistication of the attack. They don't seem to have the resources or the numbers to mount something like this, so one would naturally look abroad. But I'd be hesitant to point the finger. We're so ready to charge Palestinians or Arabs without further information. One wouldn't want to say that. Clearly, Osama bin Laden's network has the finances to consider an attack on this scale, and that would obviously be a major suspect. But I don't think we have any information yet for one to be more specific.
Were there certain lessons learned in the investigation following the bombing in Oklahoma City that perhaps authorities could use now? Of course, this is a much larger attack.
Well, one lesson was, not to assume automatically that the attack comes from abroad. I think you'd have to keep an open mind generally here, but I don't think we'd have to keep it open very long because, as I said, the number of attacks and the coordination makes it easier, I would think, in the end, to trace this one. Oklahoma City was a very small group, not linked with any organization very directly, and it was almost fortuitous that we were able to identify them. In this case, it's a much larger group, very well financed, and I would think it would be easier to determine who it is.
Okay, thanks very much. That's Peter Raven Hansen. He's a professor of law at George Washington University and an expert on counterterrorism.
Now we're joined again by James Witt, the former director of FEMA. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Mr. Witt, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
What can you tell us about what's going on today?
Well, of course, I'm not close to the situation. We're at our farm in Arkansas, and we're supposed to fly back to Washington this afternoon, but everything's canceled. So, but it just brings back haunting memories of Oklahoma City, and what happened there. But this is 10 times worse than that, and I know they're right now probably evacuated the operations center in Washington and working very close with the state of New York and the city of New York and the FBI right now, because this is what you would call a crisis and consequence situation at the same time. It's a criminal act as well as a disastrous situation. So this is going to tap all the resources that's available to be able to respond to help meet the people's needs here, and also the emergency workers up there.
In dealing with the Oklahoma City bombing situation, what were the biggest obstacles you had to face?
Well, of course, the biggest obstacles was the fact that it was a crime scene as well as a disaster scene, and the work in both at the same time to protect evidence as well as to try to see if anyone was still alive in the building. Had to be very well coordinated, and Weldon Kennedy was the FBI agent on the scene at that time and did a great job, and it worked extremely well. You were dealing with federal, state, local law enforcement, fire departments, all of it, but just massing the resources to be able to respond and to support the state and local governments is a daunting task in itself.
Did you think that the organization would be prepared for something like this?
Well, I think we're as prepared as we can be, but to be prepared for something of this magnitude would be very, very difficult. And I mean, this is really, really bad, and I know everyone's doing everything they can and trying to save as many people as they can, but this is very difficult.
What steps had been prepared for a crisis situation?
Well, of course, after the Oklahoma City bombing, that there was a lot of effort went into the anti-terrorism program and the training of it. Training of 120 metropolitan cities, and New York was one of those cities, and just to make sure that everyone had everything in place that they could possibly put in place, from a biological to a bombing to whatever it may be. And of course, that getting prepared for something like this is just really, really difficult.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. That was James Witt, the former director of FEMA. Ibrahim Hooper is the spokesman for the Council on American Islamic Relations, a Washington-based Islamic advocacy group. And we should say right now, we do not know who is responsible for these attacks, and we don't want to associate any organization with being responsible. However, he has spoken with one of our correspondents, Stephanie Mann. And Mr. Hooper says he and other Muslim Americans are shocked by the terrorist attacks which occurred in the United States today.
As with all Americans, we're utterly sick about this whole situation. It's devastating, and of course, all Muslims anywhere would condemn utterly these apparently vicious and cowardly acts of terrorism against innocent civilians. And we would join with everyone in calling for the swift apprehension and punishment of the perpetrators. I mean, no political cause could ever be assisted by such immoral acts.
Is this a reaction, a reflection, do you think, of U.S. foreign policy?
We don't know what it is at this point, so we're just joining with all Americans in just being saddened by this whole tragic situation.
Does this make your job harder now?
We'll see what develops here, but let's say it doesn't make it easier.
I mean, as in the past, when there have been terrorist incidents, people automatically turn.
Yeah, there has been a rush to judgment in the past to blame Muslims for these things, and we hope that doesn't happen. But we need to sort out the situation. I mean, our considerations may be secondary at this point to those of the perhaps thousands of people who have died today.
Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations. He was speaking with our correspondent Stephanie Mann. And once again, we do not want to associate the Muslim community with this attack today. We have no information on who was involved here, who was responsible, and we do not want to associate any organization with responsibility until we know what had happened. You're listening to a special report on VOA radio, television, and the internet on today's attacks here in the United States. And to summarize what's been going on, there has been a string of apparently coordinated terrorist attacks on major landmarks in the United States, including the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and State Department. Many people have been killed, but there are no exact casualty figures. 2 airplanes crashed into both 110-story towers of New York's World Trade Center after reportedly being hijacked. Both towers collapsed. Just minutes after that attack, an explosion rocked the Pentagon here in Washington. Also, there was smoke seen on the Washington Mall, and the White House was evacuated, and our correspondent, Paula Wolfson, is on the line with us live now. Paula, you're just outside the White House. What's the scene there?
Away from the White House. We were evacuated about 10 minutes after the president spoke, about 40 minutes after the incident at the World Trade Center.
Paula, perhaps you'd summarize what the president had to say on this.
The president vowed action against those responsible for the attacks on the World Trade Center. He says this was an apparent act of terrorism. He said we're already looking into it, and he said in very firm terms, terrorism will not stand. This is a national disaster, a national tragedy for the United States. That being said, he's trying at this point to prevent any sort of panic in the country. He's trying to keep the nation calm, but it's very, very tough to do so under these circumstances. Right now, a few blocks from the White House, there is a sort of calm out here. Everything is orderly. Police tape is up. We're behind the barricades. Everybody is waiting for some sort of word that it's okay to go back inside.
Now, this is an issue that has been in the news for years now. What has the White House done about terrorism?
There have been all kinds of commissions, all sorts of studies, and we talked to Condoleezza Rice, who's the National Security Advisor to the President, not long ago about this very subject. And she said the problem with dealing with terrorism is you can't say what you're doing because they're going to find out. You need that element of surprise, so we can surmise from that yes, they had plans, that yes, they were doing something, but they needed that element of surprise, and the last thing they were going to do was tell the media, to tell the world just what they had planned.
Paula, what is the feeling there amongst the reporters? It's shock here.
When you have a bunch of reporters and something like this happens, especially a group of pretty hardened veterans like most of those at the White House, the folks here are doing their job. The cameramen have their cameras on their shoulders focused on the White House. Others have their microphones out. They're interviewing people on the street. They're working their cell phones if they can get their cell phones to work to get more information. I think what happens in a situation like this, when you're on the scene at the White House, is you sort of go on automatic pilot and you get the job done. I think hours from now, the panic, the fear that everyone else is feeling is going to set in.
Thank you very much, Paula. By the way, do we know where President Bush is right now?
We know that he left Florida several hours ago to return to the White House. He did address the nation from Florida. He was there for an education event that was, of course, canceled. And all we know, he's on his way back to Washington, but he was supposed to land at the Pentagon. He can't go there now. They can't bring the helicopter to the White House. So we're still uncertain as to exactly when he's coming back and how he's coming back.
Thank you very much. That was VOA White House correspondent Paula Wolfson. You've been listening to a special report on VOA radio, television, and internet about today's attacks in the United States, in which several major landmarks were bombed, apparently. Many people were killed. There's no casualty figure at this time. Please stay with us here on VOA News Now for continuing coverage of this breaking news story.
It's 16 hours Universal Time from Washington. This is VOA News Now. Major U.S. landmarks are attacked, apparently by terrorists. Many killed, but no casualties.